The reason vanilla barrens, and to a lesser extent TBC and Wrath barrens, is remembered so fondly by Horde players, and was so popular, was because of a combination of bad planning and zone design by Blizzard. If you look at some of the earliest screenshots of WoW, you'll notice that almost all of it is Alliance zones and cities. And pretty much all Alliance zones were created before they worked on the Horde zones, leading many people to speculate that Blizzard just kind of ran out of time when it came to the Horde zones. And because of this, or maybe not, after all, there is no concrete proof, but what is undeniable, that for a lot of various different reasons, if you were Horde, you were going to end up in the Barrens eventually. In vanilla, there was no dungeon finder, and the low-level dungeons themselves could take anywhere from 1 to 4 hours to complete, if you did manage to get a group together. So those were out of the question if you wanted an alternative to quick leveling. Battlegrounds did not start giving experience until late in Wrath of the Lich King, mining and herbalism didn't give experience either, and obviously pet battles weren't a thing back then. So all the alternative routes that exist today to leveling just weren't there. The only way to efficiently get XP was to grind mobs or quest. The Barrens was basically a funnel point for 3 of the 4 playable races in Horde. After their starting zone, Tauren, Trolls, and Orcs were naturally led through the Barrens. And even Undead would travel there sometimes rather than deal with Silverpine Forest or Terran Mill. The zone itself was massive, probably one of the biggest zones ever in the entire game. It also had only 3 flight paths, and even less graveyards. 1 flight path in Ratchet, 1 at the Crossroads, and a 3rd at Camp Tarajo. The flight path from Ratchet to the Crossroads was an extremely short flight, but the one from the Crossroads to Camp Tarajo was the most useful one, and even then, those 3 flight paths covered only a very small portion of the map, so you had to run everywhere. At that time, you didn't get a mount until level 40, and Old Barrens was notorious for sending you to all the very far corners of the zone for questing, so you were running marathons for everything. In addition, it also had the largest level range of any zone, spanning 15 levels. So you pretty much had to go to the Barrens. You stayed there for a long time, and you had to do very long, boring runs to get to quests. On top of some of the quests being infamous for being awful. Mancrick's wife being one, and probably the most known quest in WoW. The Venture Co. Samaflange quests, the terrible escort quest, Free from the Hold, and collecting 4 zebra hoofs with a very low drop chance, and various other similar low drop chance gathering quests. The Zebra, a quest that required you to do one simple little task. Go out into the Barrens and kill zebra for 4 hoofs. Not so bad, right? I mean, each zebra has 4 hoofs, don't they? Well, actually no, because this quest, if you focused on it, and only it, would take you about an hour to complete. The problem with the quest was twofold. 1, there were not a lot of zebras, and they liked to roam alone. And 2, they had a really low chance to drop the hoofs, so you had to go around and hunt down these little bastards, and then hope the RNG gods were on your side when you finally found one. Lost in Battle, one of the most infamous quests ever. The objective was simple: find out what happened to Mancrick's wife. Only this was in the time before there was a vast, readily available database of information. So in order to find his wife, you'd have to dig through pages of comments and message boards or forums, since her body was not in an obvious location. Mancrick gave you the quest here, and his wife's body is over here, just randomly to the side of the road, not near any other quests, and very far away from Mancrick. The easiest way to find out where Mancrick's wife was to simply ask in chat. And Barrens being the most populated zone in those days, you had plenty of people more than willing to help you locate Mancrick's wife. But after the question has been asked for maybe the 10th time in the past 30 minutes, people would start giving not so serious answers, which would then devolve into more off-topic discussions, most of which involving various links to certain legendary weapons, and the tales and exploits of one known as Chuck Norris. Barrens chat. If Barrens isn't remembered for its terrible questing experience, because really I could go on and on about some of the other really terrible quests in the zone, The barrens chat is what trade chat started out as. Random trolling, anal theory, blessed blade of the windseeker, and other various in-jokes and memes. And since so many Horde players spent so long in this one zone, running very slowly all over the place because it was massive, and only had 2 relevant flight points, you had a lot of free time to chat while auto-running to the crossroads. And that is why Barrens is remembered, for Barrens chat, and its incredible leveling experience. Oh, and also Alliance raids. The Barrens chat might have been full of memes and childish trolling, but it was also full of the crossroads is under attack, since it seemed like the crossroads were always under attack. So, why were the crossroads always under attack? Well, for a number of reasons. For one, the Alliance knew that there were a lot of Horde players in the Barrens, and not only that, but low-level Horde players. The Barrens also had a very crucial geographical flaw that Alliance zones of similar level did not have. Ratchet. This little city was neutral, had a boat to the Eastern Kingdoms, and a very short run to the Crossroads, which was nearby. The Crossroads is also where a majority of the quest givers were located, so just simply taking the easy and convenient boat to Ratchet, and running leisurely into the Crossroads and pulling the guards one by one, since at this time guards did not all Zerg attackers like they do today, a small group of max-level Alliance players could hold the Crossroads hostage for quite some time. And why not? It was easy to do, and you were almost guaranteed to get a few lowbie trolls, orcs, or taurens try and fight you because they didn't know any better. So it was easy pickings, until the max-level Horde players came in to clean house. The Crossroads was a site of constant world PvP. Depending on your server, there could be a couple of small-scale battles taking place every day. The only reason the Barrens isn't more well known for its world PvP is because it's already infamous for a whole host of other things, that this aspect of it kinda gets overshadowed. And don't get me started on the landscape. The landscape of the zone. It's alright actually. Landscapes are a very subjective thing to discuss, and many people have fond memories of the barren wasteland that they spent weeks, maybe even months leveling through. Personally, I was never the biggest fan of the zone's aesthetics, but it could look very cool at times. In Cataclysm, with the remake of the old world, the Barrens was cut in half and turned into 2 leveling zones, and each zone is about the same size as other regular size zones, which should tell you something about just how huge the old Barrens was. If splitting it in half made each new zone only normal sized. And with the splitting of the zone, most of the old qualities of vanilla Barrens are gone. You no longer need to stay in any zone for very long with all the alternative ways to level. And with Dungeon Finder being available at level 15, most players totally skip it altogether. So Barrens chat isn't even a thing anymore. Blizzard fixed pretty much all the old quests to no longer be absolutely terrible. So no more spending an hour killing zebras for 4 hoofs. And guards in low-level towns are actually a threat now. So it's not as easy to take the Crossroads as it once was. So world PvP is almost non-existent there anymore. With Blizzard making changes to the zone to fix its many problems, they got rid of what made it unique. But that's not always a bad thing. Sure, we'll never have the old Barrens again, because most of the things that made it such a heavily traveled zone were because of bad zone design. So would you even want that again? Is it better to have a good zone that's kind of forgettable that hardly anyone goes to? Or a bad zone that everyone's forced to go to? Because that's what Old Barrens was. Leveling in vanilla WoW was very unique when compared to how we do things in the modern game. You see, leveling in vanilla WoW was the game. So you spent a long time doing it. And MMOs were just played differently back then. So as I progress through this video, you will notice a lot more differences than similarities to how questing is done today. First off, your character was weak. Very weak for the first 1 to 10 levels. Rogues, for example, didn't start off with dual wielding, the iconic ability of a class who was all about attacking quickly with 2 small weapons could only run 1 weapon for the first 10 levels. Also, that one weapon was a dagger, because you couldn't learn how to use other weapons until level 10. And daggers, back then and even today, do not hit very hard. They're meant to attack fast and quickly, but not do a lot of high-end damage, which is fine if it wasn't for the fact that the main ability early rogues could use was Sinister Strike, an ability that wants the slowest, highest hitting weapon you have in your main hand. Hunters started off with no ranged attacks at level 1, and instead had Raptor Strike. Raptor Strike was a melee ability that added bonus damage to your next melee attack, and wasn't very good. Also, Hunters started off with a weak one-handed weapon too, but at least it was better than a dagger. Early Hunters could easily be mistaken as a melee class if you didn't know any better because of just how much melee damage you had to do. The ability to auto-shoot while moving wasn't added to the game until Cataclysm, so you had to stutter step auto-shoot kite every mob if you wanted to use your ranged weapon, until you got your pet at level 10 of course. Now, let's look at the quests themselves for a bit. Lots and lots of quests where of the go collect this item from mobs that has a small chance to drop variety. This was to force players to have to kill a ton of mobs all the time for nearly half of the quests you did. That way, you'd get that sweet monster kill experience, which was crucial to leveling up in an efficient manner. Most vanilla quest guides would even tell you to kill as many mobs as you could, on your way to the next quest giver and on your way to quests. Gather quests all had really long cast times. If you got a rare quest that wasn't telling you to go commit mass genocide on wolves to get 4 paws, you'd sometimes get lucky and have a nice and easy gather quest. Although, these weren't really all that easy. Most of the things you had to collect had moderately long respawn timers, so if there were other players in the area, that made them take a lot longer to do. Most items were swarming with mobs that had to be cleared out first. Most of them were very far apart from each other and forced you to have to hunt them down for a long time. And also, they would take about 5 seconds on average to collect each one. Same with gathering herbs and mining, about 5-second cast times for each, with the chance of failing and having to do it again. Everything in vanilla WoW had incredibly long cast times to collect, whereas today it's almost instant, if not collected in 2 seconds at the most. And for quests, that necessarily wasn't just about going out and killing or collecting stuff. You had to read them very carefully to make sure you understood what to do. Information was kinda sparse back then, so you had to pay close attention to the quest text to understand what exactly you needed to do. Because obviously, there were no quest markers in-game. Items didn't glow if you needed them, and mobs didn't even tell you if they dropped anything you needed for your quest either. Killing mobs was hard. Your character was weak. Even after hitting level 10, mobs were powerful. On average, it might take you 20 to 30 seconds to kill one normal, non-elite, level-appropriate mob. Fighting 2 at once was nearly death, but could be handled if you popped cooldowns, or if your class had a way to handle it. Good AoE in vanilla WoW was the exception, not the norm. So, not many classes could deal with 2 mobs at once on a regular basis, and getting 3 mobs was almost guaranteed death unless you had a way to leave combat or escape. Killing large groups of mobs took planning and strategy, because they were usually clumped up together and you didn't want to accidentally pull more than 1 mob at a time. Also, mobs respawning on top of you usually also meant death, and going into a cave for a quest item usually meant that the mobs at the entrance would respawn before you were finished, because of how long it took to kill everything, and it was most times easier to just die and res outside rather than deal with trying to re-clear it, as you were probably going to die anyway. Combat was a little harder too. Today, we have inherent hit chance and expertise, but in vanilla WoW, weapon-based classes had to deal with parries, dodges, glancing blows, blocks. All mobs could block, not just mobs with shields, and misses. Half of the time you attacked a mob on a melee character, you would miss the attack in some way, shape, or form. because getting the stats needed to attack through those was on gear that you had no control over while leveling. But luckily, casters and hunters didn't have to deal with this as much. In vanilla, the only thing a ranged attack could do was miss, and maybe be blocked. Plus, spells only had to worry about misses and being partially resisted. But because you were so weak, gear felt better and more meaningful. Finding a treasure chest in vanilla WoW was infinitely more valuable than finding one in the more modern versions of the game, as it was almost guaranteed to have a green item in it. Getting a green item that you could use and had stats that you needed just felt better because of how hard everything was and how rare good pieces of gear were. Being so weak also forced cooperation. Quests with hard-to-kill bosses or lots of adds required a group, and since everyone was used to dying to more than 2 mobs at once, they were much more willing to join groups and look for them in kind. Speaking of boss mobs, vanilla WoW had this really unfair way of making boss-like mobs harder to kill. You see, what they would do is just make them a higher level than everything else in the zone. And they did this with dungeon bosses too. If you were doing a quest in the starting zone, and killing mobs level 7 and 8 for most of the quest, you finally get to the final one, which has you kill 1 mob. And then when you get to it, you'll find out that it's level 12, and destroys you for being 4 levels higher than you, as a level difference makes it harder to hit, and gives it crushing blows if the gap is big enough. Over time, Blizzard just completely removed this mechanic from the game, and for good reasons. Making mobs harder by just making them a higher level was kind of unfair. There was no auto loot. You had to hold shift with each pickup in order to manually activate auto loot, and you had to loot each mob one at a time. None of that AoE loot. Also, you couldn't see the sell price of an item unless you were at a vendor. So, if you completed a quest and got a reward that you didn't need, there wasn't really a way to know which item gave more gold, outside of prior knowledge of which items sell for more, usually, or maybe an add-on. Travel time was what you spent half your time doing. Flight points were very sparse, and it was rare for towns to have one. It was entirely normal to have to run to every single point in a questing zone without ever flying, as flying was usually reserved for going to other zones in major cities, not the conveniences of going from one quest hub to the other. Most quests were far apart from each other, and not many of them could be done side by side like today, where maybe 3 quests could be completed in the same area at the same time. So most of the time, you were traveling slowly to a questing spot to finish 1, maybe 2 quests at the same time before running to a new place for a different quest. And most classes were slow. Priests had absolutely no movement speed increases. Rogues had a sprint once every 5 minutes. And you didn't get the opportunity to get a mount until level 40, where most players couldn't even afford it on their first character for the high price. So it wasn't unusual for players just to run on foot, slowly, everywhere, to do everything, because vanilla WoW loved to have quests that made you go all over the place. The other vast amounts of your time were spent on downtime. Downtime was the name of the game. Killing a few mobs, or one especially tough mob, would mean having to sit down and eat to get your health back, or bandage. First aid was very valuable for leveling, as most classes did not have self-heals, like they do today, and you got the materials for bandages from killing humanoid mobs. Mana classes ran out of mana constantly, and had to sit down to drink all the time as well. Out-of-combat regeneration is so high today that it's not a problem, like, at all, until maybe max level Mythic plus dungeons. With all these hurdles to leveling, and all the time spent running everywhere, it did make a few things more meaningful. The world felt bigger, because you spent so much time on the ground having to slowly run everywhere. Also, reaching a new level felt more rewarding. Every 2 levels you got new abilities or ranks to train, and every single level after 10 gave a new talent point. So getting a new rank of one of your damaging moves could sometimes double its power, which gave a very drastic and fun power climb. Whereas killing a mob may have taken 30 seconds before, Now it only took 20 seconds. A new talent every level meant slowly getting stronger and stronger, with the same periodic power climbs, as sometimes hitting a new row of talents could give you an ability to double your damage output. Because the baseline was so incredibly weak, the additions and power-ups you got along the way were much more noticeable. This also made class quests more meaningful. Most class quests in vanilla WoW gave you either a much needed or crucial ability, like shaman totems and hunter and warlock pets, or gave a piece of gear guaranteed to be useful for your class, and were generally worth doing, as well as usually pretty difficult and annoying. Some infamously so, like the water totem quest chain, or the druid seal form quests. But having to work hard to get an ability or a good piece of gear did give a good feeling afterwards. So to sum things up, everything hit harder. Your character was weak. Everything took forever to complete. Everything took forever to travel to. Level up rewards were on point and felt genuinely rewarding. The low lows made the highs a lot more enjoyable. And I think that's why vanilla questing is remembered. With heirlooms, much better resource management, higher numbers at lower levels, and the ease of getting new gear in general, the game has just evolved so far past the point of vanilla WoW's harder leveling that it's basically an entirely different game. Quests nowadays are a lot more sane and reasonable, more clumped up for ease of access, mounts can be obtained at level 1, and there's more ways to gain XP outside of just grinding mobs and doing quests. I personally think the game is better with all these changes, but is it really an argument of which is better when they're both so fundamentally different? Because the vanilla model is also enjoyable in its own way, and I kind of miss talent points and new ranks with leveling. So what do you guys think? Is there even a comparison to make when they're both so fundamentally different? Many people will refer to rogues in vanilla WoW as overpowered, and point to the fact that they could stunlock someone forever until death as proof of this. But could rogues really do that? And where did this infamy come from? Back in vanilla WoW, rogues had a lot of things going well for them. Before patch 1.8, slow weapons did a lot more damage than faster weapons for instant attacks, which affected rogues' most used combo generator, Sinister Strike. Rogues could macro weapons into abilities with no cooldown on weapon swapping, so you could always hit with the sword for Sinister Strike, and always hit with a dagger for backstabs whenever you wanted. Eviscerate, rogue's main way of spending combo points, just did a large sum of static damage, and didn't scale with anything. It also did really good damage for what it was, and could do about 50% of a player's health as damage to low armor targets with a crit. Plus, DRs on CC abilities were a lot more lax during this time period, and PvP trinkets didn't remove all types of CC, only certain kinds. If you cheap shot someone for a 4-second stun, then used Vanish and cheap shot again right after, the next one would only be for 2 seconds. It's just lots of abilities didn't share DRs like they do today, and rogues had a lot of different CC abilities. Rogues had a total of 5 good CC abilities they could use. Cheap Shot, which required them to be in stealth to use and stun the target for 4 seconds and gave 2 combo points. Kidney Shot, which with 5 combo points could stun for 6 seconds, and did not share DRs with Cheap Shot. So if you used Kidney Shot right after a Cheap Shot, you could stun someone for 10 seconds. Gouge, which incapacitated the target for 4 seconds, which broke on damage and could only be used from the front. Sap, which could only be used in stealth, incapacitated the target for over 10 seconds, but did remove you from stealth during this time period. And finally Blind, which caused the target to wander back and forth for about 10 seconds, and also broke on damage. Of these 5 CCs, Cheap Shot and Kidney Shot were the most used and useful, but the other abilities absolutely contributed to the infamous status of the Stunlock rogues. Most people just incorrectly associate Stunlock rogues to only Cheap and Kidney Shot. So, where does this infamy come from? In vanilla WoW, a user put out a video by the name of World of Roguecraft that wanted to prove that a rogue who knew how to play his class was unbeatable, and showed this by getting on a rogue with no gear and only a starting zone dagger, going out into the world and ganking high-level PvPers. And with most of these kills, the rogue never took any damage, and was able to seemingly stunlock a player to death. But surprisingly, stuns played a very small part in these CC chains. The real MVP of these videos was blind. The player would go up and open with a cheap shot, build combo points, vanish, and then cheap shot again, only with a 2-second duration. After those 6 seconds of stuns were over, he would use blind, and then just wait to leave combat, re-stealth, and then sap. Wait to leave combat again, and then re-stealth and pop preparation. Preparation was a cooldown that reset all other rogue cooldowns. That way, he was good to go for another rotation. The reason he waits through a full blind and sap is to let cheap shot come off DRs. If we count up all the seconds of CC, that's 6 seconds for cheap shot, 10 seconds for blind, about 10 seconds for sap, for a total of around 26 seconds of CC. Only to reset the cooldowns of blind to do it all over again. And during these two 26-second long CC chains, the rogue also gets in at least 2 Cold Blood eviscerates. Cold Blood, of course, was a cooldown that caused your next attack to have a 100% crit chance. Which, remember, Eviscerate could crit for nearly 50% the health of a geared, low armor target in vanilla WoW. That, with a combination of a few other hits and maybe one other normal Eviscerate, could kill a player in a 1v1 situation. Even if, over the course of the 50-second fight, only 12 seconds of that were spent in a stun. Although, the main power to the stun lock was actually blind. Blind is the MVP of the stun rogue rotation. Yet you don't hear about the infamous blind rogues. In fact, blind was so strong with preparation resets that for the rest of WoW after vanilla, Blizzard made sure it excluded blind from being reset, starting with the start of the Burning Crusade. So what about just pure stun rogues? Well, in the same video, the character shows duels in the open world with an actual geared rogue, and uses this ulti with good gear and an item that refills your energy bar. The rogue was able to kill some people with only a cheap shot kidney shot combo. So he really did kill people in a 10-second stun lock. Although, not all of them. A lot of the matches required more skill than that, but he was able to kill some of them within that stun lock window. Of course, it's also well known that some of the duels in those videos were staged, but that didn't really matter. What did matter was that it was technically possible to kill geared players with a rogue naked, but only in one-on-one situations and only against classes that couldn't break your CCs, unless you were really good. So is World of Warcraft the only reason rogues were known as stun rogues and so overpowered? Kind of. Rogues were the only class who could easily stun a player for 10 seconds straight with a simple cheap shot kidney shot combo, which was pretty good. But also, rogues were just really good at the beginning of the game too, and were very easy to play well. Once patch 1.8 hit and weapons got normalized, they lost a big edge and damage that they once had, and that kind of brought them in line with other classes. So, for a while, rogues had good damage and CC. Most private servers run with patch 1.12, which is a lot more balanced and takes place after the weapon normalization patch, so you don't hear too many complaints about rogues from the private server community, who like to pretend they played vanilla WoW. So when classic servers come out, you don't really have to worry about rogues being overpowered, but rogues do have a really good matchup against most classes in PvP. That's another thing that kind of contributed to their infamous status. Against Clothies, rogues hit the hardest and only have to worry about a good mage who knew how to kite. Most hybrid classes were garbage and not really a concern for a pure DPS class like a rogue. And that just kind of left hunters and warriors. A pet could keep the rogue in combat and not allow CC chains, and warriors could break saps and hit through their defensive cooldowns. But both classes had a crucial weakness that rogues could take advantage of: the 5 to 8 yard dead zone. If a rogue was smart and just put its bleeds up and kited in that dead zone, they could just slowly bleed kite a warrior or hunter to death. So, now let's break everything down. A naked rogue could kill a player through a complicated CC chain, But that CC chain revolved around blind and not really a stun. A geared rogue could kill a player through a stun lock, but not always, and only against certain classes. Rogues had an above average damage for a majority of WoW, but not towards the end of it. And finally, rogues had good matchups against all classes in 1v1 situations. And I think it's a combination of these four things that leads to the notion of rogues being overpowered in vanilla WoW, and led to the infamous name of the stun rogues, which was only further reinforced in the Burning Crusade when mace spec rogues became a thing, especially since it's a common misconception that mace rogues were a problem in vanilla WoW too. But that's another topic for a different video. In modern World of Warcraft, entering a raid or dungeon is easy. All you have to do is get to the required level. However, this was not always the case, and you needed to be attuned to a dungeon raid in order to be able to do it. Blizzard explored this concept since the beginning of vanilla WoW, but it was in the Burning Crusade expansion that the idea flourished, and nearly all instance content required the player to fulfill previous conditions to be able to do them. In this video, we'll be exploring the different attunements in the order a player would have to do them to access the endgame content. Heroic dungeons were introduced at the launch of the Burning Crusade. They were max level versions of normal dungeons with a level difficulty ramped up and much better loot. Getting into them required the players to buy keys from different reputation vendors around Outland and the Caverns of Time, and in order to be able to buy them, you had to be revered with each faction linked to the group of dungeons in the zone. For Hellfire Citadel, you had to be revered with Thrallmar if you're Horde, and Honored Hold if you're Alliance. For Caverns of Time, you needed Keepers of Time reputation, Sonara Expedition for the Coilfang Reservoir, the Lower City for Auchindoun, and finally the Shatar reputation for Tempest Keep dungeons. We also have to mention both the Shattered Halls and Arcatraz required a key to access. However, only one person in the party has to have it or ask a rogue with 350 lockpicking to open these doors. These instances are the Shattered Halls, Shadow Labyrinth, and the Arcatraz. The only dungeon that required the player to do an attunement questline are the ones in the Caverns of Time. The player is expected to go there and start the quest to the Master's Lair. After that, they have to do the Old Hillsbrad Foothills dungeon, giving you access to the Black Morass, which is important since it will come up later for another attunement quest. Now, except for Magtheridon, Gruul's Lair, and the Sunwell Plateau, all the raids of the Burning Crusade require the player to do a quest chain. That means open world questing, some grinding, and doing a fair share of heroic dungeons. To start the journey of getting attuned, a player must reach level 68, and to complete certain parts of the process, own a flying mount. These attunements remained necessary to enter the raids up until patch 2.1.1 in the original release of Phase 3 during Classic Burning Crusade. Once a player gets to level 68, they have to travel to Deadwing Pass and speak to Archmage Alturas. And thus, the journey begins in the caves and catacombs near the Tower of Karazhan. The Archmage will ask the player to investigate the arcane disturbances and the relentless activity of the spirits near the haunted Tower of Medivh. After finishing these tasks, we're tasked to contact another mage from Dalaran, and to the Alterac Mountains we go. We find the mage on the shores of Lake Lordomir, and he'll send us to Outland, finding Khadgar, Medivh's last disciple and holder of the key. The future guardian is found in the middle of Shatra. However, he'll tell us that he has split the key into 3 pieces since he was stranded in Outland, and hid them inside 3 magically sealed containers located in 3 dungeons. Luckily for us, we can obtain them in the normal versions, and thus we venture into the Shadow Labyrinth to get our first piece of the puzzle. After defeating Murmur, the player can open the arcane container, spawning the guardian of the fragment that will loot the first key fragment after defeating it. Khadgar will then send us to finish the other 2 dungeons in Outland so we can get the other 2 fragments. After entering the Steam Vault, the player and his party will have to defeat the first boss, Hydromancer Thespia, locate the container in the water close to the boss's platform, kill the Key Guardian, and obtain his fragment. Then, we venture inside Arcatraz, defeat Zarek the Unbound, and in the next room we find the last key fragment. We then go back to Khadgar so we can finally reforge the key. But there's a catch. As a matter of fact, the key requires the Master's Touch, Medivh, but he's been dead for a while, and the last time we saw him was during the Second Legion invasion. Luckily for us, our friends in the Bronze Dragonflight can help us go back in time and relive the opening of the Dark Portal, where we can find a past version of Medivh. After helping him open the Dark Portal and defending him from the relentless assault of the Infinite Dragonflight, Medivh will touch the Restored Apprentice's key with his magic, and after returning to Khadgar, obtain the Master's Key. This key will finally let us enter Karazhan. Now, if we want to kill Lady Vash and her minions, we have to enter her lair, the Serpent Shrine Cavern. However, its entrance is blocked by a magical waterfall, and the only one that can open it is Sharthus the Heretic. The Naga is imprisoned in the heroic version of the Slave Pens. Unfortunately for us, his shackles are enchanted and require 2 signets. The Earth Signet found in Gruul the Dragon Slayer, and the Fire Signet found in Nightbane. Obtaining the Earth Signet will just have us kill Gruul with a raid of 24 other people and looting it from his corpse. For the Fire one, we'll have to summon and defeat the optional boss in Karazhan, Nightbane. To
To summon Nightbane, we need to finish a quest line that we can start after getting honored with the Violent Hold faction by killing trash mobs and bosses in Karazhan. We then head to Archmage Alturius, who will ask us to find Medivh's journal. The last person who knows about it is Ravian, who we can find in the Guardian's library after defeating the Curator. Ravian will have us talk to the human next to him, Kamsis. He'll tell us that the journal is in the possession of the Shade of Iran. Therefore, we go to the poor, tortured soul, defeat him, then loot him for the journal. With Medivh's journal, we go to the Master's Terrace and read it to witness some memories of the fallen Guardian. As a matter of fact, we see him cast a powerful spell on the Dragon Arcanagos who came to warn him about Sargeras' corruption. The poor worm is burned from within, and we can deduce that this has been transformed into Nightbane. Back with the Archmage Alturius, he asks us to dig up the past and obtain a charred bone fragment in Deadwing Pass from the remains of Arcanagos. With it in our bags, Alturius will send us to Area 52 to seek out the aid of his colleague, Kalena Laythrid. The Kirin Mage will then ask us to find 2 books, the Book of Forgotten Names from Darkweaver Sith in the Sethic Halls, and the Tome of Dust that we ripped from the dead body of the Grand Warlock Nethercurse in the Shattered Halls. After acquiring the book, Kalena crafts a blackened urn and asks us to revive Arcanagos as Nightbane and defeat him in the Master's Terrace in Karazhan. Therefore, we venture once again in the Cursed Tower, fight the reanimated dragon, and obtain the Blazing Signet. Going back to Sarkthus, we give him both the hard-earned signets, which lets him cast on us the Mark of Vash, which dispels the enchantment of the waterfall at the entrance of SSC and grants us access to the raid. With each attunement, the difficulty seems to spike quite a bit, and it was no easy feat to obtain the right to enter Tempest Keep and challenge the final boss, Kel'Thas Sunstrider. Getting there is the culmination of 2 lengthy and quite hard questions. Let's start with the first one, the Cipher of Damnation. Going to their faction hub in Shadowmoon Valley, the player can begin the chain with the quest, the Hand of Gul'dan. This leads us to speak to Earthmender Torlok, who asks us to get him the essence of the enraged elementals of fire, earth, water, and air using a spirit totem. These spirits will mention a powerful spell, the Cipher of Damnation. Having no idea what it means, Torlok will send us to Oronak Tornheart, who he thinks might know a bit more about it. The old orc doesn't trust us in the slightest, and will test our prowess in classic World of Warcraft fashion, finding tubers with the help of boars and destroying Ravager eggs. With the small test complete, Oronak explains that he was a lieutenant of Gul'dan and that the spell we're seeking is the one used by the warlocks to sever the shamanistic link between the orcs and the elements of Draenor. However, and there is always a however, Illidan obtained the text when he took over the Temple of Karabor, now known as the Black Temple. He divided it into 3 parts. Oronak sends us after these 3 sons who each went after one of the parts. Grom-Tor, first son of Oronak, has located the fragment he was tasked to find. He gives us the information we need and asks us to find it inside a Naga cave. We kill the guards, loot the key to the chest, and obtain it. After that, we head over to Artor, second son of Oronak, who will task us to kill demons around the Illidari Point so we can get the crystalline key and his bow. We then defeat another demonic servant of Illidan, Veneratus the Many, and obtain his fragment of the cipher. The old orc will then send us after his third son, Borok, who has been keeping tabs on the Blood Elves guarding the last part. He explains that our objective will be hard to obtain as the elves have been moving it around. He also tells us he has his eyes on the messenger who carries its location. However, our target is always followed by a guard. Luckily for us, the messenger is addicted to a certain plant, the blood thistle. We go to Shattrath to meet with a shady businessman who might know where to obtain the drug. Tobias the Filth Gorger will give us what we want in exchange for a rotten Arakoa egg, which we provide pretty easily. With the bundle of blood thistle in our bags, we prepare our cutting ambush. With our bait ready, Envoy Icarius will send off his bodyguard so he can sniff his blood thistle in peace. Sadly for the Thistlehead, we pounce on him and assassinate him and loot the Stormrage missive. Borak studies it and tasks the player to get a Blood Elf disguise from the mobs in Eclipse Point. Once we have it, we can get the information we need from the Grand Commander Rusk. Finally, we can assemble a party and kill Rule the Darkener, who will drop the 3rd fragment. With the cipher complete, Oronak has one more task for us: summon and kill Suruk the Firelord to prevent another catastrophe. Therefore, we gather a group, travel to the Altar of Damnation, and do the deed. With that, we finish the quest chain and are ready to get to the next part. After completing the Cipher of Damnation, we receive a letter from Shattrath where Khadgar tells us that we did a good job with the Cipher of Damnation and that the Naru wanted to test our might in a series of trials. Adal explains that he fears that Kel'Thas might use this Cipher of Damnation for nefarious deeds, and he needed our help to stop him. However, we can't enter haphazardly into the Tempest Keep, and we have to show Adal the extent of our mercy by heading to the heroic version of the Shattered Halls. There, we have to clear the Time Gauntlet and save the prisoners from the Shattered Hand Executioner. With his unused axe as proof of our good deed, we head back to Adal. Next up, our strength is tested by defeating Warlord Calithresh in Heroic Steam Vault and Murmur in Heroic Shadow Labyrinth. After showing Adal how strong we are, the Naru wants to test our tenacity. For that, we have to finish off Harbinger Skyrus in the Arcatraz Heroic while protecting Millhouse Manastorm and assuring his survival. Happy with our progress, Adal will give us one final trial, Magtheridon. We enter the raid, kill him, and we're done. With that, we get our Tempest key that attunes us to the Tempest Keep, and the Phoenix Fire brand, which is a useful item for tanking certain bosses like Leorthus the Blind or Illidan. To get inside the third instance in the Caverns of Time and relive the final climactic battle of Mount Hyjal, the player is given a very simple task by Sor Dormi: get the Vials of Eternity. However, this was the hardest attunement to obtain during the original release, for it required defeating Lady Vash and Kel'Thas. And during the original release of the game, it took the first guild 73 days to get Vash's Vial, and 130 days before obtaining the Vial held by Kel'Thas. As Illidan once said, "You are not prepared," and he was right. In fact, we can't get into the halls of the Black Temple without doing the Attunement questline first. Therefore, we have to go to Shadowmoon Valley and start there. The start of the questline will be slightly different if you chose to be with Aldor or the Scryers, but what we need to do is still the same. We learned that the secrets of the Temple of Karbor, known as the Black Temple, are written on a Draenei artifact, the Tablets of Bari. We're then sent to stop the efforts of the Ashtung and claim the tablet for ourselves, since they might be useful in our fight against Illidan. After obtaining 12 fragments, we learned about the existence of a medallion that granted the High Priest of Karbor unlimited access to the space, but its location is only known to Akama and his close circle. We're tasked with eliminating Oronu the Elder. On his body, we find a letter that's a great interest to our efforts: orders from Akama. We learn that the medallion has been split between 4 Ashtung corruptors, so we hop on our flying mount and look for them around Shadowmoon Valley and kill them. With our 4 fragments in hand, we still can't enter the Black Temple. We're going to need to speak to Akama since he's in possession of half of the medallion. To do this, we have to go to the Warden's Cage and interrogate Sonoru about Akama, and surprisingly, we learn that the leader of the Ashtung, Deathsworn, was expecting us. We just need to prove our allegiance and kill the demon Xandris, who has been tasked to keep an eye on Akama by Illidan. And in a plot twist, we learn that Akama has betrayed the demon hunter and is now keeping a facade of loyalty while plotting to undermine him. Once Akama is sure that we're not working for Illidan, he meets with us and explains that he has already foretold our arrival and our role in Illidan's demise. He also tells us that the medallion fragments we possess are replicas and the real thing is in his possession, except for the last piece. Akama sends us to rescue Udala from the Arcatraz since he knows its location. Sadly, when we find Udalo, he's been dead for a while, but he left us with precious information written on a piece of paper, Atamal. Going back to Akama, he deduces that the last piece of the medallion is located in the Atamal Terrace, an old Draenei temple that's been overrun by Felworks under Illidan's control. We travel there with a group, summon Shadow Lord Deathwell, and take him down. We take the Heart of Fury from him and go back to the Warden's Cage. Akama reforms the medallion and asks us to bring it to Adal as a token of his promise to fight Illidan when the time comes. The second part of the attunement starts inside Serpent Shrine Caverns. After killing Fathom Lord Carathrus, one of Akama's underlings appears, the Seer Ulam. He has been tortured because Illidan started getting suspicious about the leader of the Broken. The Seer tells us to warn Akama before taking his own life so the secret of the Ashtung betrayal isn't compromised. Learning about what happened, Akama has a plan, but before we can start the assault of the Black Temple, we have to help him keep Illidan's trust. For that, we enter Tempest Keep and kill Alar while under the disguise as an Ashtung Broken. With that, we make sure that Illidan's eyes are focused towards Kel'Thas, and we can get to the next step of our journey. For that, we have to obtain a phylactery from Rage Winterchill, a lich that died during the final assault on Mount Hyjal. Why do we need it? Akama himself doesn't know, as he just saw the item in one of his visions. Therefore, we go to the Caverns of Time where we fight a Rage Winterchill, the first boss of Battle for Mount Hyjal raid. We defeat him and obtain the Time Phase phylactery. Akama realizes that it can help him free his soul that's under Illidan's control. With that, we can make the final preparations on our attack on the Black Temple. We then go to Adal, who shows us a vision of the battle outside the Black Temple, led by another Naru. We go there and find Ziri leading the charge, and this is the distraction Akama needed to start our infiltration of Illidan's stronghold. After talking to it, we complete the quest and obtain the Medallion of Karbor, signaling the end of the attunement to the Black Temple. And with that, we cover the journeys any adventurer had to take during the Burning Crusade in order to do most of the endgame content. A barrier of entry that most old casual players didn't overcome, and that's why attunements were abandoned starting the following expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, and haven't come back since. For many players, Wrath of the Lich King was heralded as WoW's ultimate peak. Everything following Arthas could never be topped, and to some extent, they would be correct. The numbers themselves would prove that Wrath was the highest point WoW subs had ever reached when Blizzard had continued to post a subscription count on occasion. Wrath had shown it had no intention of slowing down either, as its sub count only climbed higher, rather than a steady downward spiral with every patch. Wrath wasn't shy of dislike systems either. The famous mounted combat in both PvP and PvE was ultimately never received well by a majority of the player base. So, what made players so strongly fond of Wrath? At its peak, Wrath hit just short of 12.5 million total players subscribed every month. This would occur towards the final patch of WoW's existence, patch 3.3, Fall of the Lich King. WoW had truly become known as a worldwide phenomenon, and was the hot topic of discussion almost everywhere in the gaming industry. How did the port of an old RTS game reach such a mountainous size, when the original itself wasn't on the same level of playtime as WoW was? At this point, WoW already had the many systems and progression and MMO required to succeed from its predecessors of vanilla and TBC. Wrath was an enlarged version of what people already enjoyed so much about WoW, and almost perfectly captured people's attention. The Burning Crusade introduced arena-rated PvP, stronger class balance, more challenging raids, and new zones for players to explore upon flying mounts. Wrath would take these things and mold them into something even more enjoyable for players to play. There would be even more ways to participate in PvP, better class changes, the hardest raids, but the best loot for the time, and larger zones to sightsee. Wrath had also introduced a very new class, one that die-hard fans were familiar with since the arrival of Arthas in the original Warcraft 3, the Death Knight. Death Knights were wildly loved by the player base, and their usefulness was downright overpowered in all forms of content. Not only this, Blizzard added many quality of life changes to the game. Things like the barbershop, paid race changes, dual talent specialization, faster leveling, and the LFG tool. While some of these changes were received with mixed reviews initially, the community had grown to appreciate the usefulness of their additions, and couldn't imagine a world without them. Though subscriber count jumped upwards at the announcement of Wrath, it's easy to believe this is because of the reveal of Arthas. The story of Arthas' downfall has been told to death many times over. Warcraft 3 players were more than excited to get their hands on the new version of their favorite game, but the ending had left many players unsatisfied. Arthas would climb the massive tower and claim the Helm of Domination and become the Lich King in full, but the fall of the former Lordaeron Prince had ended there. Players were unsure of what would happen next, and were eager at the arrival of their favorite Death Knight to come back. With the announcement and continuation of Wrath, however, word spread quickly and players everywhere shared the news, and the players who had been kept waiting for half a decade would finally learn what's next. The pros of Wrath were so high that no matter what kind of player you were during its time, there was always something for you to do. Whether that was to farm badges for your PvE gear, push your PvP score, or just collect achievement rewards for the many new additions Wrath brought with it. Achievements had reinvigorated all of WoW's history, as now there was a true reason to return to older content and prove your dedication. It could be things as simple as exploring zones in entirety, or as advanced as completing the toughest raids without a single death in the entire run. Needless to say, Wrath brought with it insanely new ways to approach the endgame, and allowed players to explore this freedom at their own pace. There weren't many cons to the game's longevity, but things like the gear score add-on, vehicle combat, and debatably the LFG tool, players seemed to ignore these glaring issues. Finding a group for pug runs could be difficult, as lots of the community had this add-on to tell them on inspection how geared you were rather than your actual skill and content. A player could be invited with a large gear score but perform terribly, as opposed to the raider with a lower gear score and execute mechanics flawlessly, and with solid damage to par. With the release of Classic Wrath, we've seen these issues repeat themselves, but this time with the removal of LFG until Phase 4, making group finding much tougher on the more casual players of Wrath. Regardless, the player count remains at a staggering amount, as even now you can log onto a medium-sized server in Wrath Classic and see massive influxes of player characters running around Dalaran performing their usual activities. Wrath gave you a reason to log in every day and see your fellow guildmates in chat talking up a storm with their weekly and daily quests, and even for alt characters this held true. People were always looking for something to do in preparation for their raids, and for Wrath's time, these raids were legitimately challenging. This contributed to the overall lack of add-ons at the time, accurate guides on bosses and classes, and players generally weren't as good at the game as they are now. It's also hard to ignore the content in Wrath was always new to players, experiencing things differently with every coming patch, whereas in Classic, the content had existed for over 15 years and had been practiced repeatedly and documented the most effective strategies for all to read and learn upon, yet players continue to enjoy the content it provided. WoW players like gear and big numbers. When certain players could no longer keep up with the fast-paced gameplay retail had soon begun to ask of them, they turned to the more relaxed version of their favorite MMO. Wrath content was just right in the department of not too easy for you to fall asleep at your keyboard, but not too hard to require tons of weak ores and add-ons in order to get an easier understanding of the content ahead. Players like to be rewarded for their efforts too, as Wrath's loot was much more optimized and special than retail. So there was a point every class would want something different, and with a little bit of RNG and grinding, they could start doing more damage within just a few weeks or less. Wrath's content had been done over and over at this point. The purpose of the game is to truly push the limit Blizzard allows within their game, and see how big of a number they can reach, either solo or with a rate of 25. But even again, with Wrath's re-release, there are some players who never got to experience the wonders that were hailed to the Lich King. It's brought entirely new eyes to the fandom of WoW, and many veteran players are more than happy to share this bond with people, like reliving the old days where the only tool you had to learn were the people around you. Blizzard at this stage had masterfully crafted an understanding in their audience that solo progression was just as important as the endgame group content. Not only would players have great incentives to log on each day to do their dailies for loot, but the leveling of Wrath was on another level. You would begin with your faction on either a Zeppelin or a boat to Northrend, and you would immediately be thrust into the war that has been ongoing with the Scourge. It's difficult to ignore the story that's being told by Blizzard as you go through the zones, as they had just begun to use more voice lines and speech bubbles more often, rather than just the text when you accept a quest. Even if you were to ignore these things, you could feel what the environment felt in those zones you leveled in. For example, within Dragonblight, you could see the corpses of fallen dragons around you, the Scourge attempting to use necromancy to bring back these dragons, and the shrines of the 4 dragonflights themselves corresponding differently for each flight. The zones themselves tell a story, and it's easy for players to learn what's happening around them. Not just this, but even the music of the zones in Wrath had managed to become the fan favorites of many all around the community, especially Grizzly Hills. In top moments where you're fending yourself against the Scourge, the music can kick in and fill you with either dread or hope. The dread of how truly unmatched the players are against the Lich King's forces, but the hope that you can fight until you're last. With each patch, players would get closer and closer to the eventual downfall of the Lich King himself. More lore being added, and there was even a point your might was tested against the strongest lieutenants of the Scourge to prove you were worthy of the task ahead. You'd begin at conquering Naxxramas, storming the halls of Ulduar, and showing your strength in the Tournament of Champions. This is what players since Warcraft 3 had been waiting for. This long and steady upward hill to finally face the Lich King himself and see what would happen to their beloved character. By now, many had learned of Arthas' goals, and even some wished Blizzard had added the option to join the Lich King. Though, with the release of patch 3.3, as the patch name suggests, the Lich King would ultimately fall to the players. However, as Arthas drifts away, his father assures Tyrion that there must always be a Lich King. Tyrion believes he must be the one to bear this burden, but it's there where we see Bolvar reveal himself and is soon to be crowned the Lich King. And we are once again left in wonder about what may happen, similar to the ending of Warcraft 3. Bolvar had been a character players had known since the release of Vanilla WoW, as Varian Wrynn was missing and Anduin was in his stead. But since Anduin was just a boy, Bolvar was known as his pseudo-replacement for now. Players had grown to love Bolvar, most definitely the Alliance, as he had been with them since the beginning and worked closely with diehard fans to thwart the actions of Onyxia. During Wrath's existence, Blizzard would release their very first in-game cinematic. At the time, this was unheard of and completely revolutionary to the game's storytelling, and many more cinematics would follow in its name. Seeing the Lich King, Horde, Alliance, and eventually the Forsaken in action with so many moving parts was fascinating to fans, and they were left asking Blizzard for more. This is where we learned that the long-known Bolvar 4 dragon had perished in their attempt to storm the Wrathgate. This was true until we learned the Lich King had retrieved his body and was tormenting him and planned to make Bolvar one of his most powerful Death Knights, but first wanted to use him as bait in taunting the forces that opposed him. Once we had beaten Arthas and saw Bolvar take up the crown, it left players in a state of, whoa, that was crazy. And all they do is tell others and spark conversations on every corner of the internet. This is what sparks the remembrance of Wrath of the Lich King. You could attribute the success to many things. Some people play just a roleplay and create their own stories in the game Blizzard had created, and that's more than fine. Though Wrath's success had been more than attributed to its players. The sheer wonder and love they had, and spreading the word to others about this enjoyment they had, was enough to bring in more players around the world. The gaming community was talking about WoW and its success Wrath had brought, and people were eager to see what the fuss was all about. Gamers in general would become united and be able to relate one thing that they could talk about for hours on end to each other. People would make many friends and other lifelong partners in real life. Blizzard had, whether knowingly or not, shifted all attention into their biggest game by showing off what they were capable of. Without the ease of access and speaking to people in-game, WoW may have never succeeded in its launch, as the people and the interactions you have are truly what make the world to almost any player. Obviously, many people are familiar with what happens next, and after Wrath ended, they were left at a cliffhanger of the character everyone had been talking about, and now are unsure of what happens next again. Will we fight Bolvar next, or some other threat? The players wanted answers, and with Arthas gone, many were fulfilled with his story and more than comfortable in finishing their journey with him. The task players had set themselves to learn had been completed, and now all that remained were the sweet memories of the adventure WoW had taken them on. Of course, many people were excited for new content and are just happy to spend their time around the people they enjoyed in the game that they loved. Blizzard's track record had shown that the only way is up, and for as long as people continue playing, they will deliver what they want. So on August 21st, 2009, Blizzard announced a new expansion, Cataclysm, at BlizzCon. Players had placed their trust into Blizzard and were more than sure that they could deliver another project that would skyrocket their popularity and bring in even more people from around the world. Unfortunately, however, Cataclysm wasn't everything it had been hoped to be, and without Arthas in the picture any longer, the talk of Blizzard's golden child began to dwindle. No longer was the spotlight shining brightly down on WoW, and the people started to fall into a sense of confusion for what the expansion's theme even was. Not many could understand the story as easily as Wrath had presented itself, and it caused players to lose interest over time. Personally, I think the reason Cataclysm failed in conveying certain themes was because of the massive uptaking of a world revamp that they had delivered. Not just did many players have to say goodbye to Northrend and Arthas, but the old world they had originally begun in as well. There was no way, at the time, to revisit the original Azeroth, and people had difficulties connecting to the new main antagonist of WoW, Deathwing. Despite even vanilla hinting to Deathwing and his character through many quests and an entire raid, not many played the game for the story. But Wrath had managed to instill a great interest in its story. Arguably, I would say it was the themes of Wrath where the majority of the expansion felt hopeless to the forces that opposed you. Generally, the environments were much darker, and the quests held more insidious tones to them because it was what was required for Arthas to work correctly. As expansions have progressed, it's not to say players haven't gotten their share of grimdark aesthetics, but it's no coincidence that fans prefer the sort of edgier material they produce. A great example of this being Blizzard's Diablo franchise. Without the massive influx in conversation about WoW and what's currently taking place, subscriptions would begin to dwindle, and this followed with each subsequent expansion into Warlords of Draenor. It was here that the subs had nearly reached Wrath's level, and people were ecstatic for what was to come from WoD, but were soon let down by the many systems and overall buggy launch WoD had provided, showing an insanely dramatic plummet in subs. It was here Blizzard had then decided to no longer reveal their subscriber count to the players, saying there are better ways to measure WoW's success. Regardless, WoW would continue onward in its lifespan, and even to this day still holds hundreds of thousands of players, if not over millions like it once was. There's always something to do in WoW, and it's been said by players many times that the only thing that could kill the game is Blizzard itself, as its fans think they are too invested in the game to quit, or just can't leave what they've grown to love over the course of nearly 2 decades of content. WoW will continue to exist for many years to come, and hopefully Blizzard continues to improve the many things players love. Easily, players jumped at the chance to jump back into the old world, and it was such an overwhelming amount. In fact, Blizzard was completely unprepared for it. Queue times could last as long as 5 to 8 hours, sometimes more, and in certain releases of content within Classic, these queues reappeared. Many servers were added into the game, and just recently the inclusion of the Hardcore Classic was made, where if you die even once, your character can no longer be played. It truly revived the old feel that fans had, no matter the age range. For all players know, Hardcore could go so far as to Wrath again, and not only will they get to relive on fresh servers of Wrath, but with such an intensive fix that it almost makes WoW feel like a horror game. Even if WoW were to end tomorrow, players would take to all forms of social media and reminisce about their favorite moments from the game's history, bonding with one another about the game that had brought them together. This will conclude why I believe Wrath of the Lich King to be so remembered by players. It had joined the people under one banner, and all they could think of was their favorite game. If you were part of gaming during the years of 2008 to 2010, you most certainly had heard about World of Warcraft and the fandom surrounding it.
Whether they be good or bad, these are 10 things that people use as arguments for classic WoW servers. 10 things that are remembered about vanilla WoW. Number 10. Only having one spec per class. Were you a warrior who wanted DPS? No, you weren't. You were a tank. You wanted to be a shadow priest? Do you PvP? No? Then you're a healer. A holy priest healer, to be exact. No one went full disc. Were you a druid who wanted to do anything in raid? No, you were there to give innervate to the healers. The holy priest healers. Specs weren't really balanced like they are today. You were lucky if one of your specs was raid viable and you were going to like it. Plus, since dual spec wasn't a thing, and changing your spec too much cost too much gold if you did it too often, you kinda had to pick something and just stick to it. Number 9, 40-man raiding. It's hard enough to get 20 competent people together at the same time every week to run mythics. I can't imagine how much of a pain in the ass it was to get 40 people together. But I bet It was fun to feel like you were throwing an army of people at the hardest bosses, instead of just the elite task force thing we've got going on today with half as many people. Number 8. Class quests. At level 10, hunters had to go out and tame 3 different pets before being able to tame a real one for themselves. Warlocks had to do lengthy quest chains to summon their demons, then defeat them before they got to use them. Shamans had to run halfway across the world to get their totems. Rogues had to level up 2 class-specific professions to make their own poisons, or to pick locks. The list goes on and on. Pretty much all classes had quests that needed to be completed in order to get basic abilities. And you could be severely gimped if you ignored them and just leveled up normally, since some of your core class abilities came from these quests. Nowadays, you just get all your abilities automatically as you level up. There are still some class-specific quests in order to get special armor and weapons, but they're optional, so most people never do them, or even know that they exist. The closest thing we have to class quests in Legion is the artifact quest lines, which are actually pretty faithful to old-school class quests, as they have you use all of your abilities in creative ways to solve problems. Number 7. Grinding. Everything was a grind. Quest items routinely had low drop rates. There wasn't enough quests to get to max level, so you had to grind mobs for those last few levels. You would miss all the time with new weapons, so you had to go out and grind out weapon skills to use them. No daily quests meant you had to grind any and all gold you got, since there was no way to earn it passively. Many raid fights required you to have resist gear that you had to grind. Many attunements required random items from dungeons that only dropped for one player, so lots of dungeon grinding. There was also lots of attunements to do pretty much all of the raids, which all required a huge grind. Getting high warlord in PvP meant full-time job levels of grinding PvP all day, every day, and many, many more grinds. Nothing we have in Legion is close to the grinding that went on back then. Unless you're a mythic raider, part of a world-first pushing guild trying to grind out as much artifact power as possible, and even then it's not really comparable to some of the vanilla grinds. Number 6. No catch-up mechanics. Start late in vanilla and want to raid the new Naxxramas raid? Well, you'd better run AQ40 first. But in order to run AQ40, you're going to need gear from at least Blackwing Lair. But if you want to do Blackwing Lair, you need a cloak made from Onyxia scales, and at least gear from Molten Core. But if you want to do Molten Core or Onyxia, you need gear from Upper Blackrock Spire, Stratholme, and other high-level dungeons to at least get your Tier 1 set, plus fire resistance gear. And don't forget all the attunements required to do all of those places. There's a reason Blizzard remade Naxx for Wrath. Almost no one got to do the original one. Today, if you want to start raiding in the newest raid, there are so many different ways to get gear good enough to start doing normal mode, it's not even worth listing them here. If you have an alt that you casually play on, you probably have gear good enough to start at least running the normal mode of the current raid tier, and then just work your way on up from there. Number 5. Carrying around stacks of food while questing. Today, leveling has been made so easy that Blizzard is actually looking at ways to make it less brain dead, without reverting it back to how it used to be. But in vanilla WoW, mobs hit hard, mana pools were low, and default regen was garbage. Some classes had some kind of regen mechanic tied to getting killing blows on mobs to kind of lessen the effect, but no matter what class you played, you needed to have food on you at all times. After killing maybe 5 to 10 mobs, your health or mana would need to be replenished, and you could be lazy and just auto-attack, but eventually you were going to have to eat and drink. Mages were actually extremely helpful for other players for their ability to create food and water and trade it to people. Today, the only people who need to eat or drink are healers in mythic dungeons to get mana back in between pools, and raiders for the buffs they provide only, and not the actual mechanic that eating provides. Food items while leveling are just kind of an optional thing that might sometimes give you a buff if you get a special food item from a quest. And until pretty recently, you still started off with food in your bags when you made new characters. But that's no longer the case. Every class has some kind of self-heal or bubble now, and you don't run out of mana at low levels anymore unless you're specifically trying to. Number 4. Codexes. Believe it or not, some class abilities couldn't be learned from your class trainer, or from class quests. You needed to get special items called codexes, which dropped mostly from raid bosses in order to learn basic class abilities. Like hunters, for example, got their trank shot ability from a codex, which was one of the few ways to purge rage effects back in the day. And most other classes could only learn the highest spell rank of certain abilities from codexes. It was a fun RPG element to the game that sometimes you would get stronger or learn new abilities by killing bosses. Today, they're not really a thing anymore, but there are various items that give cosmetic abilities, like the different animal mage polymorphs, or the pet training manual that teaches your pet to loot corpses for you. So it's kinda similar, but you no longer learn core abilities from items that drop in raids, like the codexes from vanilla. Number 3. Hunter pets. Today, hunter pets are more of a cosmetic than they are anything else. But it used to be that pets had special abilities and stats depending on which beast you tamed. For example, gorillas were the only pet to actually have an AoE, so getting to a high enough level to actually tame one was a special event. Lots of different pets had special hidden abilities as well, like a certain rare cat having a less than 1 second attack speed, which made him attack faster than all other pets, or how wolves from AV could run faster than mounts. It was a treat to go out and hunt rare beasts to use their hidden abilities, or to just go out and get a new special ability to use on a normal pet. But players just had to ruin it. Eventually, everyone found out which pets were the best pets, and everyone was running around with exactly the same pets. I remember in Wrath of the Lich King when I first started raiding, the best pet was a wolf. So all hunters only had wolves. Or maybe cats, if they didn't mind a slight DPS decrease, as that was the second highest DPS pet. So Blizzard over the many expansions kept trying to streamline pets so that players could have more choice with them, until finally they just got rid of nearly all special abilities and just made the good ones baseline that everyone could use. Now, there are still pets with special abilities, don't get me wrong. Turtles can shell shield to act like a personal tank, corehounds can bloodlust, moths can battle res, but it's a complete shell of its former self, from when all pets had special abilities. Number 2. The community. Did you know people used to actually know each other on their respective servers? So many things you did in-game required a group of people, and you couldn't always rely on your guild to run everything, so you had to pug things. And with there being no auto group finders, people had to actually talk to each other and play nice. You would develop a rep on your server for being good at what you did, or bad. Being known can go both ways. You'd recognize people in trade chat, or notice people were running by them in major cities. Forcing people to interact with each other in order to do everything made the game's in-game community seem bigger. Today, you mainly just talk to your guild and rarely other people unless you absolutely need to. Running random dungeons are pretty much quiet. It's very common to get in a group with 4 other people and not say a word to them over the course of a 30-minute run. If you go out and do world quests and use the add-on to search for groups, like I do, to make them quicker, I can't remember one person saying a thing in over 100 world quests. In fact, I can't remember anyone ever saying anything in a world quest group, despite doing hundreds of them like I've said. I personally love this. I'm totally antisocial and I hated having to look for groups to gear up and raid. The Dungeon Finder was my favorite addition to the game, but being forced to talk to people to do everything is a thing that's remembered about vanilla WoW and one of the cornerstone arguments for people wanting classic servers. I can understand this argument, even if I personally don't really care for it. And number 1, talent trees. Old school talent trees, where you had a set amount of points to spend on things you thought were fun. I personally loved old school talents. You got a new one every time you leveled up, which made new levels a lot of fun, because you knew you just got a little bit stronger in a tangible sense, and could feel like you were progressing to something bigger. Sometimes reaching a new talented ability could double your damage output, since a lot of the core abilities were buried deep in a spec's tree. Nowadays, you get a ton of your core spells early on, so that you can actually get used to doing what you'll be doing at max level. It makes more sense this way, and I do like it, but a part of me also really like the old method better. The talent trees of today do also sometimes give you big boosts to your abilities when you get a new row unlocked, but it's just not the same as slowly working your way up to it over time, since you just get it all at once every 15 levels or so. Hell, the last time I had fun leveling a new character was with my demon hunter, and that was because you got a new talent every 2 levels instead of every 15. It almost felt like having old talent points again. The artifact weapon design was really close to recapturing that magic. I did like getting new traits on the weapon while leveling up for the first time in Legion, but the fact that you just get everything eventually kinda kills some of the fun of it. To the point where I kind of like how the Netherlight Crucible forces you to pick an ability over another. That element of choice is fun for me, and made me want to farm artifact power for the first time ever in the expansion just to unlock all of the choices. Alterac Valley. Alliance players know it well. Horde players know to add it to their exclusion tab when queuing for random battlegrounds. Why is it remembered so fondly? What was so great about it? AV was added to the game in patch 1.5 along with Warsong Gulch, as the first 2 battlegrounds added to the game. Alterac Valley was a huge battleground that was supposed to be PvPvE, or player versus player and also player versus environment. The original AV had tons and tons of NPCs in it, and in order to win, you had to fight your way through an army of players and non-player characters in order to take out the enemy general, all while having an army of your fellow players and friendly non-player characters at your side. Because there were so many NPCs, you pretty much had to do the bonus objectives to win. Or, as they were called back then, just normal objectives. Korok the Blood Rager. This was a troll who guarded the Snowfall Graveyard. He was essentially a mini-boss in AV that attacked both Horde and Alliance players, and was part of a quest to get some sweet weapons, and, of course, to take the graveyard. When first introduced, he wasn't all that much of a threat, and patrolled in the middle of the Field of Strife, until the next patch where Blizzard buffed all his stats and moved him to the graveyard, making him a true mini-boss in the middle of a PvP battleground that could require up to 10 or even 15 players to take out. The captains, Belinda Stonehearth and Gal Vanagar. Just like Korok the Troll, essentially mini-bosses inside a battleground, except these ones are faction-specific, meaning you can help them out. Having either of them up meant constant buffs for anyone near them to the tune of 20% extra health and a slight size increase. For some reason, these 2 captains are some of the few things to survive all of the AV prunes. The Cavalry Riders. Apparently, this was the objective added to allow low-level players to help with the battleground. You see, in vanilla, you could queue for AV at level 51, and be paired with level 60 players. In order to call the cavalry, you needed to complete a series of quests that involved taming the wolves, and then going out to the other side and killing the rams. Once you and your team got enough turn-ins, you could then call in a cavalry charge, where a group of riders would patrol around your base. If you had enough rep, you could then talk to the leader of the cavalry and tell them when to charge in. Deciding when to use your cavalry charge could be a game changer, as they went straight to the enemy base and did real damage. The upgraded guards and patrols. Just like in RTS games, where you can spend resources to upgrade your units, you can turn in armor scraps to your blacksmith to upgrade your guards and patrols. In fact, guards can be upgraded up to 3 times with enough scraps, which just generally makes them stronger. The airstrikes. In order to use airstrikes, you have to first save all of your airstrike commanders from the enemy towers. You simply talk to them and then escort them back to base. But if they died, they do not respawn. And just like the upgraded guards, you need to loot players to get special items to turn in order to use them. Once your team has enough, you can then take a beak into the field of strife and protect it for 1 minute. And then you'll be able to tell your bat or griffin riders which areas to attack. Just like with the cavalry, since you can tell it when to attack a location, it was best to save it for a planned attack and to not just use it all willy-nilly. The elemental lords. These things were like summoning raid bosses to help you push into enemy territory. In order to summon either the ice guy for the horde or the tree guy for alliance, you needed to loot corpses of players for bloods or crystals. Then, after turning in a metric ass ton of them to your base, probably around 500 or so, you then had to escort your shamans to the middle of the field and then have 10 players present to perform the ritual of summoning. Then, after summoning the elemental lord, you had to wait 20 minutes for it to stop standing still in the field of strife and finally take off towards the enemy base. As long as you had a group of people protecting the elemental lords, you could probably push all the way into the enemy base with one, as it was pretty unstoppable by players and NPCs, if properly guarded, before getting destroyed by the enemy general, that is. The infantry attack. An infantry attack is similar to the cavalry charge, in that you can send in an attack of NPCs to the enemy base. In order to do this, you need to control one of the two mines on the map, or both of them to speed up the process. In order to capture a mine, you just need to kill the mini-boss of the mine, who is a neutral NPC. Once you control a mine, you can then start to collect a resource the mine generates that you can turn in. Once enough of this special resource is turned in, you can then get attack plans from your base and give them to an NPC in the field of strife to send out an infantry attack. The tower and bunker commanders. Inside each tower was a commander who was a much tougher to kill elite mob, and who gave nearby friendly players a buff periodically. In order to capture a tower, you generally needed to kill this mob, which also caused other guard mobs in the area to stop spawning. So it was a huge tactical advantage to take one out, or defend your own, in addition to the normal benefits of taking a tower, which gave you an extra warmaster in your boss's room to defend your general. Most matches went pretty similar to how AV is done today. One large group of players would run around and rush objectives, while small groups of players would go out and do the objectives I listed. And then the match would devolve from there based on how things went, until your team managed to make a successful push into the enemy base and destroy the general. With so much to do and such a huge space to do it all in, reaching the win condition could take anywhere from 3 to 20 hours, or about 5 to 8 hours on average. AV was not something you could do without a huge time sink. Now, let's talk about the Alliance advantage. For those of you who probably don't know, Alliance have an advantage in this battleground over the Horde. In Vanilla WoW, Blizzard put out a list of the most deadly NPCs. NPCs who killed the most amount of players in the game. And at the top of that list was Drekthar, the Horde general in AV. You know why Drekthar was the #1 killer of players in Vanilla WoW? Because Alliance actually got to him more often than the Horde did the enemy general, and therefore died more often. In fact, the Alliance general was only number 15 on that very same list. The two guards who defended Drekthar both had more kills than the Alliance general as well, appearing at numbers 4th and 6th on the list of deadly NPCs. But what gave Alliance an advantage? Well, for starters, the bunkers. It was easier for an Alliance player to capture a Horde tower than it was for a Horde player to capture an Alliance bunker. Once an Alliance player got to the top of a tower, they could just go inside a little room and be out of line of sight of all the archer NPCs. And until very recently, in an Alliance bunker, you had to kill at least 2 archers and then maybe capture the flag at a weird angle if you wanted to be able to capture it without having to kill all of the archers first, since the flag is just out in the open instead of inside a small room. This little thing just gave Alliance players a straight up easier time to capture an objective that is worth the same amount of points to both sides. It was fixed somewhat though. Horde players can now capture bunkers without killing a single archer now, but that is a very recent change, like changed in Legion recent. The Alliance mine is located in a more out-of-the-way location, so it's easier to defend or just ignore and no one will touch it, and capture, in relation to the Horde mine, which is literally on the main road and on the way to the Horde base. The Alliance home base is easier to defend than the Horde's. You see, the Horde's base only has a wooden wall as its natural defense, while the Alliance have a wide open bridge as the only way to get to their base. A bridge with archers at the top of the bunkers, who used to have an incredibly long firing range and attacked you the whole time you were on the bridge. In fact, these archers near the bridge appear higher on the list of the most dangerous NPCs than the Alliance General as well, taking the 7th spot on the list, right after one of Drek'Thar's guards. If it ever came down to a turtle, Alliance have a much easier time defending a bridge than the Horde can defend their home base. Stormpike Graveyard. The Alliance Graveyard right in front of the bridge is the most fortified objective in the game. It's near the Alliance respawn points, and has a ridge next to the bridge that has a free pass to attack anyone trying to capture the flag, and another higher ridge in which players can snipe down Horde players with impunity, and not to mention an easy bottleneck to defend a little further out of the graveyard, where the Horde players have to go both uphill and in between two mountains. This graveyard just has all kinds of natural geographical advantages. The Horde equivalent graveyard has 0 such advantages, and is probably one of the easiest places to take in the whole game, as it's just out in the open. Same goes for the graveyards inside the bases. The Alliance one is right in front of the General's building, surrounded by elite guards, while the Horde graveyard is off to the side, isolated from everything. And with it being so isolated in comparison to the Alliance counterpart, a single Alliance player can easily just run through the entire Horde base and go straight to the graveyard and take it with little problems. The neutral Stonefall graveyard is just straight up closer to the Alliance starting point, and it's on the way to Galv, so Alliance get an offensive graveyard to spawn at before Horde can capture Stonehearth graveyard, which is their offensive graveyard point, and usually the next point taken after killing Belinda. But, to be fair, this is not a good graveyard to have during late game. It's pretty much exclusively an early game only advantage. There were a few more things to mention, but I'll stop there since I mentioned most of the important ones. Just to give a meaningless anecdotal account of the battleground today, I ran AV 7 times in a row on my Horde rogue to get footage for this video, and lost all 7 matches. Then the instant I hopped on my Alliance character to get Alliance footage, I finally won a match, and then my next 3. Now, these all might seem like minor things, but you have to think of it in the context of 40 random people getting together and just staying in a huge zerg all the way down to the enemy base. The Alliance advantages just help out a mindless group of people more than the Horde one does. And since pretty much all PvP Horde players know about the Alliance's small advantages, it is one of the most widely blacklisted battlegrounds on Horde side, along with the Isle of Conquest, which only further gives Alliance an even bigger advantage, because no seasoned Horde players are queuing up for AV, while almost all Alliance players do it. Also, a lot of these advantages weren't really noticeable in vanilla WoW when PvP lasted a lot longer. The Alliance only gained a noticeable advantage after the changes were made to make it quicker. But funny enough, there was a short time in the Burning Crusade in which Alliance players called for a boycott of the battleground because Horde was winning all the time when they introduced the reinforcements mechanic, which is a great segue into, so what happened to the battleground? Marks of Honor happened. Added in patch 1.8, Marks of Honor were simple. You got 3 for a win and 1 for a loss. At this time, they were simply turned in for extra honor, but with Marks of Honor being a valuable reward from Battlegrounds, Blizzard thought it would be nice if people could actually finish Battlegrounds in a timely manner. So they also removed a lot of NPCs from the BG, and closed off the eastern and western segments, completely removing 3 types of NPCs from the map, and making the battleground a little smaller. Also, all the NPCs left had their stats reduced by about 15 to 30%. Patch 1.10. Korok the Blood Rager and his band of trolls have picked up their bags and left Alterac Valley for greener pastures. The hostile troll mini-boss at the Snowfall Graveyard was removed, giving Alliance an extra advantage as it was basically a free cap for them now. Patch 1.11, Blizzard removed NPC guards and reduced the hit points of all the NPCs in AV again. I think you can see the trend. Blizzard over time kept slowly taking away the PvE aspects of the battleground in favor of a more PvP focused experience, by removing the amount of NPCs on the map, and making the ones who remained weaker and weaker. Now we go on to the Burning Crusade, and the Marks of Honor become even more of a hot topic item. When they were first introduced, they gave good rewards, extra honor and rep, and Blizzard kept making changes to make AV not last so long. But with the Burning Crusade method of using Marks of Honor, they were in much higher demand than ever before. You see, Blizzard made it so you needed to use Honor and Marks of Honor to buy certain pieces of gear, which forced players to have to do all the battlegrounds to get fully geared. The only problem was that AV still lasted a hell of a long time, and it was possible to spend hours in AV and not get a single Mark of Honor, because you just had to leave early. So instead of just removing AV Marks of Honor from gear, or just removing AV Marks of Honor in general, they made 2 big changes to the battleground instead. The first being more nerfs to the NPCs in the battleground. A lot of the NPCs in the home bases of both the Alliance and Horde side got turned into normal NPCs, down from elites, so they were a lot easier to deal with. Lieutenants, the 6 tougher than average elites who provided buffs nearby players, were just removed from the game entirely. The 4 commanders, who, like lieutenants, were tougher than normal and provided buffs to nearby players, who also occupied towers and patrolled graveyards, making them tougher to cap, were just removed from the game. No replacements. Lieutenants and commanders were just poof, gone. In fact, the in-game AV book called Peeling the Onion still mentions the commanders and gives advice on how to deal with them, despite them no longer being in the game. War Masters were no longer spawned by destroying an enemy tower, but they could still be despawned if one of your towers got taken. So before, it was possible to have up to 8 War Masters at a time defending your general. Now you always only have 4, and that number can only ever go down. But removing all of the elite NPCs from the enemy bases was only the minor change made this patch. The real big change was the addition of the reinforcements mechanic. Reinforcements essentially added a timer to the battleground, so it couldn't ever last as long as it did back in the day. Both sides started out with 600 reinforcements, and once the other side reached 0, you won. You lost reinforcements for each player death, captain deaths, tower losses, and you lose all of them if your general is killed. These 2 changes, coupled together, destroyed any remains of the original AV, and are still how the battleground plays to this day. And with these 2 changes, the AV Zerg was born. Players would just ignore everything and rush to the enemy base as fast as possible and just pull the general with the whole 40-man raid. There was no longer any PvP, and BGs were won by whoever got to the enemy general first, or by the Horde if they decided to defend at the Iceblood Graveyard. Remember how I said there was a time in which Horde actually had an advantage in the battleground? Well, this was the time. With the reinforcements mechanic, Horde actually had a geographical advantage if they decided to turtle at the Iceblood Graveyard. This graveyard is the first graveyard Alliance can get that is Horde controlled, but has a small hill that you have to go around in order to access, which Horde players could bottleneck and defend with only like 20 people indefinitely. Since the graveyard was so close to the choke point, they could respawn and be back to defending quickly, and since Horde could get to this bottleneck first and very quickly, it was almost impossible for a Pug Alliance group to actually break this turtle and cap any towers, while all Horde needed to do was capture 2 towers to win. as they'd have a reinforcements advantage. Alliance players complained so hard about this strat that a few battle groups organized a boycott for AV. So Blizzard made a few changes to the battleground, with moving the Horde spawn point further back so they couldn't set up an unbreakable turtle before the Alliance had a chance to stop it. Blizzard also added buffs to the 4 War Masters that increased each other's damage and health by 25% for each one, which also applied to the General. With this, players actually had to cap a tower or 2 before pulling the enemy general if they wanted to Zerg. In Wrath of the Lich King, during one of the final patches of the expansion, Blizzard removed Marks of Honor from the game. And with the removal of Marks of Honor, well, nothing changed. AV stayed the same. Later on in WoW's history, Blizzard would buff the bonus damage and health the War Masters gave each other, and their general, since people were able to just outgear the extra damage, and very recently, Blizzard moved the archers and bunkers behind pillars, so you no longer need to kill all of them in order to capture a bunker as Horde. In Blizzard's attempt to make AV more accessible, and to be able to be finished in a timely manner, they had to strip down and gut what AV used to be. AV started out as a PvP mixed with tons of PvE and bonus objective turn-ins for a truly PvPvE experience, and over time got turned into a capture towers and then pull the boss battleground with very little variation. With Blizzard's successful attempts at shortening the battleground, it's literally a waste of time to do bonus side objectives that used to turn the tides of the battle. But with how long it takes to tame 25 wolves, or to turn in massive amounts of bloods to summon an elemental lord, you're wasting precious time and resources that could be spent sitting in a tower, or waiting in front of the enemy general's throne room. They take too long and are unnecessary, since getting into the opponent's base is no longer an issue. But is that really a bad thing? Is making the battleground quicker such a terrible thing? Would today's WoW player base be able to even put up with a slow battleground that takes ages to complete? I'm pretty sure people would still complain endlessly about it like they do today with everything else. I can't see too many people queuing up for it willingly. I mean, look at how many people complained about Ashran, which was the closest thing Blizzard had to old AV. I know it's not the same and it's not a totally fair comparison, but would you really queue up for AV more than just once? If it still lasted upwards of 6 hours to do, would you put up with it more than a few times just out of being curious what it was like? Unless it had really good rewards? I know I probably would, and past me, who used to queue up for Wintergrass and Tolbarad every chance he got, would. So, I know the market for it is still there, and it would be cool if they just converted it back into its old form, and brought it back as like a special event or something. After all Horde players just block AV when they queue for random battlegrounds anyway, so nothing of value would be lost if it was just removed from the random queue and made into a single queue battleground only. That might be a good way to add it back to today's modern game.
Now, if you play a Ret Paladin in Vanilla WoW, and if you're not fighting an undead, you only have one damaging ability, until the target goes below 20% health anyway, in which case you'll gain access to a second damaging ability. The way Ret Pallies do most of their damage is through their seal system, which buffs their auto attacks and does different things depending if you consume it with your judgment ability, which is their only damaging move, which requires you to have a seal active in order for it to work. So basically, a Ret Paladin's DPS revolves around activating a seal, using judgment to consume that seal to do its unique effect, and then reapplying another seal to buff your auto attack damage while you wait for judgment to come off cooldown. And that's basically how Ret Paladins played. They just waited around for judgment to come off cooldown, as they couldn't really do anything else damage-wise, unless they also wanted to use their AoE ability on single target, or if they were fighting undead, in which case they gain access to 2 new abilities called Exorcism and Holy Wrath. Now, this may surprise you to hear, but this version of the Ret Paladin wasn't added to the game until 2 weeks before the game went live. So basically, completely untested and added in at the last second. Because during the beta, Red Paladins had a little bit more to do than just activate a seal and use Judgment. Red Paladins had 2 more damaging abilities called Crusader Strike and Holy Strike. Holy Strike was basically the Paladin version of the warrior ability Heroic Strike, where it would turn your next weapon swing into a harder hitting attack. But Holy Strike turned all that damage into pure holy damage, which meant it bypassed armor and was actually really good. And Crusader Strike is an ability Paladins have in the live version of the game, and they basically have had the ability ever since it was given back to them at the beginning of the Burning Crusade. And what Crusader Strike did in WoW's beta was it would do instant damage and then put a debuff on the target, which would increase the holy damage they took for the next 30 seconds. And this debuff would stack up to 5 times. And Crusader Strike did not have a cooldown. So Paladins actually had a spammable damaging move, as well as a decent holy damage ability on a 10-second cooldown with Holy Strike, which would hit harder the more stacks of Crusader Strike you had up on the target. And this version of the Paladin in the beta was actually pretty good, and did decent damage, unlike how a baseline Red Paladin played in Classic WoW, where they were one of the lowest DPS classes in the game. So, why did Blizzard remove Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, and then basically give them nothing to replace their only damaging abilities? Well, there are some theories and rumors about this, and I plan on going over both of them. First up, mechanically speaking, these 2 abilities were removed from the game because they just made the Paladin go incredibly quickly. Both Crusader Strike and Holy Strike cost mana to use, and caster classes in vanilla WoW had to worry about their mana. So they had to be careful about which abilities they could spam before running out of mana. And while Paladins did good damage with these 2 abilities, having a spammable Crusader Strike caused them to run out of mana a little bit too quickly, and the vanilla WoW class design was absolutely not about making the mana cost lower, as there were a couple of other classes in the game who were unviable because they also had so much mana problems. So, many people theorize the reason they converted Red Paladins into the auto-attack version they got for vanilla WoW was a band-aid way of solving the mana issue that Crusader Strike brought up. If the Paladin only needs to use 1 ability every 8 seconds in order to do damage, then they don't have to worry about mana as much for their DPS. Regardless of the fact that this promoted a style of gameplay which wasn't as fun as what Crusader Strike and Holy Strike might have brought about. And there was also the debuff limit. Vanilla WoW only had an 8 debuff slot limit, which was later increased to 16, which is what we have at the start of Classic WoW. And if the Paladin's main damaging ability, Crusader Strike, required them to take up one of these debuff slots, then Paladins wouldn't be able to use their main damaging ability in raids anyway, and they'd be stuck with only Holy Strike every 10 seconds. Because in beta, when Paladins had both Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, Judgment and Seals didn't really exist in the way they did in vanilla WoW. Beta Judgment was literally just Holy Wrath, where it was an AoE that only worked on undeads. And when they changed the Paladin class to how it eventually worked in vanilla WoW, they changed Judgment into the 8-second cooldown ability, which consumed Seals in order to do damage. And then they just added in Holy Wrath, which had Judgment's old effect. And the seal system was completely added to the game along with this Judgment change, where the seal system in vanilla WoW requires you to activate a short-term buff on yourself, which is usually about 30 seconds, and then you consume that 30-second buff with your Judgment in order to do damage, and other various effects. And while that 30-second buff is on you, it gives you an auto-attack buff, which does various things depending on which seal you're using. And the things in beta WoW, which were called seals, were just changed into the blessings, which is kind of confusing to explain in this video, but to make it as simple as possible, they completely created the seal mechanic from scratch at the start of vanilla WoW, and then for some reason gave it a naming convention after another set of abilities that Paladins already had, that functions nothing like how the seal mechanic works. Anyways, since they didn't have the seal and Judgment mechanic alongside Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, they never really got to test how that would function for the class, allowing them to have 3 damaging abilities that they would then use regularly along with the auto-attack buff from seals. Considering that system would still have the mana problems and the debuff slot limit problem, I can see why they decided to simplify things for themselves and just give them the auto-attack thing instead, so that Paladins could focus on being buff bots. You see, Paladin buffs were really good, but they only lasted for 5 minutes,
and you can only place one on a person at a time. So having a paladin in your raid meant everyone else in your raid could do more damage and healing. But that also meant the paladin spent most of their global cooldowns just buffing everyone else, making them one of the only pure support classes to exist in the game, which could be another big reason why they were changed to focus on auto attacks instead of having an active rotation with Crusader Strike, because they wanted the paladin to use those global cooldowns on buffing the raid instead of using them on damaging moves. Of course, the seal mechanic wasn't a huge success either, as it was all but removed after Vanilla WoW, since while it did have a few fans, it wasn't very good, and I'm sure everyone probably would have liked it more if it just did a little bit more damage, or, was a little bit more involved than having to press 2 buttons every 8 seconds. So, if you go back and watch any beta footage of World of Warcraft that has paladins in it, you can actually see Crusader Strike on the debuff bar of the video I'm showing right now, as a shaman is going out and fighting a paladin in the open world, and you can see the Crusader Strike debuff on him as he's killing the higher level paladin. But Vanilla WoW was already taking a long time to come out. It was in development for 5 years before they launched, so they started just rushing things towards the end, but it's kind of a wonder why they decided to make such a drastic change to the paladin class 2 weeks before the game launched, which kind of segues into this next section of the video. Now, outside of the mechanical reasons that people theorize, these aren't, confirmed in any way, about why they removed Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, there's also the rumors of 2 game developers joining around the same time the seal system was added. 2 famous EverQuest players named Furrer and Tiggle joined the WoW development team at around the time Paladins got this drastic change to their damaging rotation. And the change to the Paladin class was so last second that even in the official Vanilla WoW guide, which was sold in stores, they featured the Paladin old class systems, including Crusader Strike, Holy Strike, and calling their blessings seals. And you see, these 2 players were infamous for absolutely hating hybrid classes, to the point where they would stage protests in-game whenever they found out a hybrid class was doing anything except being a buff bot, or something like that. They just really didn't like the fact that a hybrid class could do as much damage as a pure DPS class, and they were well known for wanting hybrid classes to basically be terrible as a tax for being able to do a whole bunch of different things, which would make sense why Paladins lost their fun rotation as soon as they joined and were given the infamous seal system for Vanilla WoW. Although I'd call these just rumors instead of what actually happened, because there isn't confirmation this is why it happened. And in fact, Ghostcrawler is largely credited with changing Paladins to how they were in Vanilla WoW, and Ghostcrawler is also the person who wanted hybrid classes to perform just as well as pure DPS classes. So what probably happened was Ghostcrawler just wanted to try out this change with the Paladins and see how it worked. Saw that it failed in Vanilla WoW, and then changed his philosophy going forward to try to push all classes to basically being equal. So, all that being said, there's not too much credit to the Furrer or Tiggle changing Vanilla WoW Paladins into a garbage spec, although this wouldn't be a video about beta ret Paladins without mentioning this very famous rumor. I just couldn't find any confirmation for any of these rumors besides lots of speculations on forums and stuff, which is usually the case for very famous WoW rumors. So, there you have it. The reason Paladins only had one damaging ability was because it was given to them at the last second without any kind of testing like all the other classes got, as well as a whole bunch of rumors and theories as to why they made this decision in the first place. After Vanilla WoW, Blizzard changed Paladins to no longer be buff bots. They allowed them to actually tank, and gave them competitive DPS. Arguably, it was much better than it was in Vanilla WoW though.
In this series, we look at some of the more unknown things in WoW, with today's episode having a heavy focus on Wrath of the Lich King, in celebration of Wrath of the Lich King Classic. First off, let's go over the biggest raid in WoW's history in terms of actual size. World of Warcraft has countless raids, ranging from the smallest single boss raids to the biggest seen across the WoW universe. And while Wrath of the Lich King is well known for its many small raids, like Eye of Eternity, Onyxia's Lair, Vault of Archivon, Obsidian Sanctum, Trial of the Crusader, and the Ruby Sanctum, it is more well known for its largest raids, which is also the largest raid in the game, and seen by a large portion of the community as the best raid in the game's history, Ulduar. Ulduar is a massive Titan facility kept guard by the various Titan keepers in order to keep track of the planet's corruption and to contain the old god Yogg-Saron. And because of this, the raid would have to be huge to compensate for the building-sized denizens towering above you like the ant you are. And while it would be easy to say Ulduar is huge because it needs huge rooms for huge bosses, which to be fair is partially true, there is a few other things that lead to the raid's overall size. Mimiron, while the smallest of the Titan keepers, smallest of all the bosses in the raid, and possibly the smallest boss in any raid, he is not to be messed with. Using his giant can-opening device, he summons various parts of his Voltron in order to fight you, instead of taking you on himself. And while his area is a decent size, it is not the area itself that takes up so much room, but the massive cosmic train you ride to get to his arena. Straight out of Stormwind and Ironforge, this tram covers massive distances very quickly, and unlike those trams, this one actually has you in full control of when it leaves and arrives. No worry of it leaving just before you get on, unless your raid members are very funny people. This tram acts how you're supposed to get to this far remote facility, and while this section is large, it is nothing compared to the other path, that being the Expedition Base Camp, Iron Concourse, and Formation Grounds. This area alone is as big as many multi-boss raids, and yet this entire area is just for one boss, starting off with you gathering your allies into various vehicles and sieging countless iron dwarves, golems, and giants, even taking on various mega-sized mechs, all leading to the eventual fight against the super tank Flame Leviathan, in a massive vehicular base siege on the gates of Ulduar. And while we could go into much more detail about this amazing boss fight, you should go to our top 10 fights with vehicle mechanics video for more in-depth details on it. The size of Ulduar is amazing to say the least, especially as many of the other large raids are full of dead zones, locations that have nothing to do there, no trash, nothing. For example, here is the full map for the battle for Mount Hyjal. As you can see, the map is huge, and while I'm sure anyone who has done it before know the bottom half cannot be accessed, you would think at least the top half is accessible, usable, and it has some purpose to it being there, maybe some mobs and stuff, and no, not really at all. And while there is the odd mining node here and there, otherwise the rest of the raid is left just empty, with the entire raid really only taking place in a couple key locations. And really, looking back to the Wrath of the Lich King raids, it really is a mix box. Naxxramas and Uncia's Lair, Recycles, Eye of Eternity, Obsidian Sanctum, and Ruby Sanctum, all just one room, Trial the Crusader, just one room, except the last boss, and the Vault of Archivon, one room per patch, all the same, just connected together. Although I guess putting with all these mediocre raids is more than enough worth it for the amazing raids that came alongside them of Ulduar and Icecrown Citadel. A pair of raids that if you did not experience while they were current content, you would be doing yourself a disservice not to do it in WoW Classic. Northrend was once intended to be an entirely frozen wasteland, choosing to not give us Snow Zone 1, Snow Zone 2, Snow Zone 3, based on only the very north and south glaciers. They instead chose to also include some great north climate-like regions, like from Canada and Greenland, leading to wonderful landscapes like Boran Tundra, Howling Fjord, and the ever-amazing Grizzly Hills, the #1 zone and ambience for most players, except Shulzar Basin, which is just its own thing. But those were just the launch zones. Every expansion has their launch zones and then their eventual post-launch zones, introduced to add new stories and content that could not be done in prior existing areas. The Burning Crusade added the Isle of Koldanis, the Cataclysm introduced the Molten Front, Pandera the Isle of Giants, Thunder Isles, and the Timeless Isles. Warlords of Draenor added the Tannan Jungle, although that was intended to be at launch, it was added post-launch. Legion added the Broken Isles, and the 3 Argus zones. Battle for Azeroth added Mechagon and Nazjatar, Shadowlands added Korthia and Zereth Mortis. You may have noticed I missed one expansion there. Yes, Wrath of the Lich King, the one and only expansion to have not added a new zone. An expansion so front-loaded it was able to keep people invested and preoccupied with the world without ever adding a new zone to explore. And even without any post-launch zones, it is still known for its amazing lore and zones, a favorite expansion by many players, especially with the wonderful leveling and questing experience. Wine is well known around the globe, a fermented alcoholic drink made usually of grapes that has aged for years, sometimes decades, getting better and better with the years. And at least for Christy Stockton of One More Glass within Dalaran, a city of snobby mages, the perfect place for wine snobs. Christy sells Dalaran Red, both in bottle and cask form, each with a flavor text of improves with age, and a duration of 365 days. These white quality drinks will actually age in your inventory, and after having purchased either the bottle or cask of Dalaran Red, and waiting an entire real year, you receive a bottle or cask of aged Dalaran Red, now green quality. And while these items are also available on the vendor, aging them yourselves, you save 5 times the gold. So if you really wish to get some aged Dalaran Red and are fine waiting a year, you can save a lot of gold. However, this is not all. While the vendor only sells these 2 versions of the drinks, you will notice the green quality versions still have a duration and flavor text. So holding on to them yet again for another year will yield you another bottle or cask of peaked Dalaran Red, a blue quality item that finally has its duration removed, and the flavor text aged to perfection. And while these items have literally no actual use, they do at least let you enjoy a nice drink, either alone or with up to 24 other raid members. So, if you're entering the Frozen North and wish to have a cask of perfect wine, you may wish to buy it as soon as you have the gold. That way, the day you kill the Lich King, you have the perfect drink to celebrate with your fellow raid members. Something extremely special, proof of time. Although the fact there's no purple and then orange quality wine that ended up taking 3 to 4 years is kind of sad, really. Legendary wine is something we desperately need these days. Wrath of the Lich King had many cut features, the most well-known being the infamous dance studio, something that has become a joke in the community, and even Blizzard themselves with a garrison mission referencing it. But there was many other things cut from the expansion, 2 of which we feel are the most notable are the rune crafting system and aerial PvP combat. Wrath of the Lich King made vehicles much more of an actual mechanic on its own, with many raid fights, dungeon fights, and quests utilizing the vehicle system, so it's obvious to see why they would want to make a PvP use of it too, and while they did with the Isle of Conquest and Wintergrass for ground-based vehicles, they also plan to do so with air-based vehicles. However, for one reason or another, it was cut, seemingly pretty late into development too, as it actually made it onto the Wrath of the Lich King box art. The only time the expansion box has shown a right-out lie advertising something that is not in the game, even to this very day. Although there is some argument for the Demon Hunter and the Vanilla WoW box art, that was more so just a character and not an advertised feature though. Now onto something much less known, the Death Knight rune crafting system. Originally announced at BlizzCon, the Death Knight would actually be able to customize the runes on their weapon, and not in the way you may think. As of launch, Death Knights got their own class-specific enchants to add to their weapons and rune forges. However, originally it was planned to work far differently. The original Death Knight rune forging system had you, upon collecting a new weapon, go to a rune forge to transform it into a rune blade, allowing you to carve runes into it and then outside of combat be able to enchant runes into the blade. Like live, you would be given 6 rune slots with the blood, unholy, frost, and death runes. However, unlike the Death Knight we got, you would actually be able to choose whatever runes you wish to inscribe and add special enchantments to them to make them recharge faster, empower the spells consuming them, or transform into death runes, even increasing with use much like the original Rogue's lockpicking skill, allowing for more and more powerful runes, meaning if you wished you could have 6 blood runes. However, with Blizzard's goal to try and de-incentivize people choosing all of one type, they seemingly just could not make it work, and locked it to 2 of each type, putting the special effects onto the rune forging system as special weapon enchants. Which overall is a good thing. While it sounds interesting, in practice it feels like it would be an absolute nightmare. Although, what would be a better fit for the relentless undead juggernauts that was the most broken class at its launch, the Death Knight? Speaking of the hero class Death Knights, they were called hero classes for a reason. A callback to the MMOs of old, a good example being the Jedi in Star Wars Galaxy, the original Star Wars MMO. This Jedi class was obscenely difficult and time-consuming to obtain. Having the class originally proved you went through an insane amount of time, effort, and resources, and as a reward you gained this extremely powerful class, which easily outperformed all the other classes, making you a god amongst peasants. While this worked in its time period, it's easy to see the major flaws in this. Although at the time, that was the Wrath of the Lich King's development, they decided they wanted to do this for the Death Knights as well. Originally planned, you would need to wait until Wrath of the Lich King's launch and level from 70 to 80. Upon doing so, you would then betray humanity itself and pledge allegiance to the Lich King himself. In order to do so, you'd be given a long and difficult questline in order to earn his trust. And doing so, you would then unlock the Death Knight hero class. And a hero class it was. As with the launch of the expansion, the Death Knight was so overpowered, they could quite easily outperform an entire party with their huge defensive, damage, and self-healing capabilities. And while Blizzard quickly realized their mistake, as making a Death Knight only required this hilariously easy task of reaching level 55, and making a class that was better than the rest of them in every way, it took them quite a while to bring the class in line with all the others, nerfing them again and again before finally getting them somewhat in line with the rest of the classes. The idea of a class being overpowered as a reward for completing a difficult and time-consuming task may have worked out one time. These days, with how modern games don't like to waste your time as much as they used to, and with the internet being so easy to access, search, and compile compared to the old days of random message board rumors, It's hard to keep anything truly a secret when it's just going to be made into a step-by-step guide 2 months before release. Lastly, with the mindset grown within the community around any and every power benefit, it no longer became something you made the choice to work towards, but something that was now required, and so it had to be changed, or else everyone who was not a healer would be forced to unlock and play a Death Knight. In the beginning days of WoW, there was not a specific role for each spec, examples being the Feral Druid, which while sharing the same tree could be a tank or a DPS, meaning a druid saying they were feral would not tell you what they actually were. Same for paladins, as for a lot of early WoW, most of their time in tank spec was actually with mostly holy talents. Death Knights were the final experience of this, however, as with the very next expansion Cataclysm, they redid talents, forcing you to choose a tree to specialize into, with each of them having an assigned role, requiring you to then fill these trees to a specific point before then being able to put points into any of the other trees. So what made the Death Knights so special then? Well, the fact all 3 of their specs could be DPS, which is pretty common for the DPS-only classes like Rogue, Hunter, Mage, and Warlock. However, these 3 specs could also all tank, each spec having their own style of tanking and DPS. Frost focused on using the frigid winds of Northrend to slow the attack speeds of your enemies, while increasing your own, bolstering your armor with ice while slowing your enemies as well, making kiting easy, even more so with dual-wielding blades and ranged casts. Blood focused on dodging and parrying attacks, and while failing to do so meant taking heavy damage, you made your health pool a resource, sacrificing health to gain resources, while also countless abilities to feed your own health pool, sacrificing your own blood to steal the blood of your opponent's lives, literally using your defense as a weapon, swarming blood worms to leech your opponents dry and refill your own. And lastly, Unholy, which focused on plaguing your enemies with sickness and disease, summoning undead ghouls and gargoyles to decimate your enemies, enhancing your allies with Forsaken magics, defying magic itself with barriers of anti-magic, and shields of enraged, plagued, and bone. With each spec having its own style for not only DPS but also tanking, this meant each spec had its own niche of boss fights it was best suited for. Unholy, for its anti-magic capabilities, dealt with tanking mage-based boss fights that dealt lots of magic damage. Frost was great at dealing with physical bosses, who usually cleave through the average tank's armor, now glanced from their tainted armor, sedated by the swirling colds, and Blood with its ability to sustain itself when healers had issues, able to act well as an off-tank tanking constant low damage, sometimes able to go entire fights without needing any focused healing at all, allowing for more healing to go elsewhere, although suffering if bled too deep. And while they all had their use as DPS, as well with Frost's rapid attacks and ranged attacks and Unholy's undead and decay, Blood was the weakest of the 3 for DPS. Having a few good times here and there, it acted more as the best solo content spec, especially for leveling. And to end off the video on a quick fact, something few remember, but the actual Cataclysm expansion was announced at BlizzCon 2009, 3.5 months before the release of Icecrown Citadel, and then another 4 months until the Wrath of the Lich King's death. A major part of that being the obscenely long time gating of Icecrown Citadel, taking 3 whole months from the raid's launch, for the heroic version of the raid to open. This caused quite some oddities at said BlizzCon, an example being many people asking about not the upcoming expansion, but the upcoming raid against Blizzard's most famous villain. No, not Illidan Stormrage, he's not a villain, he's an anti-hero. The Lich King. A good example of this being that during the Cataclysm itemization panel, while speaking about changing how stats worked and what stats appeared on what gear, for example removing mana per 5, replacing it with spirit, decided to randomly announce Shadowmourne, again in the middle of a Cataclysm itemization panel. Something that is just obscenely odd to me, really. They didn't even speak about its stats or anything to have it mesh with the panel, they just sort of announced a new legendary out of nowhere, showing just its name and appearance. Although they did later make an official preview showing the special effect it had, while explaining a general idea of the process of obtaining it through going into the raid to gather resources in order to craft it. They weirdly again did not share its stats, so just kind of odd.
Back in the old days of WoW, ranged weapons needed either arrows or bullets in your bags to be used. But come the Cataclysm expansion, they were just removed from the game, and now all bows and guns just have unlimited shots. This video will talk about the brief history of the ammo mechanic in the 3 expansions that it was in the game. Back in vanilla WoW, in order to fire your ranged weapon, you needed ammo to be applied to your weapon, as there was a slot in your character panel to show what kind of ammo your weapon would be using. The ammo did a set amount of damage and just increased the amount of damage your ranged attacks did. So as you leveled up, you could buy stronger and stronger ammo, just like you'd buy stronger and stronger weapons today. There were special bags that could only carry ammo called quivers and ammo pouches. Only bullets for guns could be placed in ammo pouches, and only arrows for bows and crossbows could be placed in quivers. Since arrows were used for both bows and crossbows, despite real-life bows and crossbows requiring different types of bolts. Now, you could equip and use bullets and arrows from any old bag, but there were some advantages to taking up one of your bag slots to use a quiver. For one, your quiver and ammo bag would actually appear on your character like any other piece of equipment. No other bags in game could appear on your character except these two. Now, outside of cosmetics, they also auto-reloaded your ammo into your gun or bow. You see, only hunters, rogues, and warriors could equip and use ranged weapons, but only hunters could auto-shoot with ranged weapons. Warriors and rogues had to manually shoot every shot. So when a hunter would auto-shoot, they eventually ran out of ammo mid-fight, as they were only in stacks of 200, and you'd use ammo with nearly all of your abilities, in addition to using one for each auto-attack. But once you ran out of that 200, you'd just stop shooting, which would be really bad in the middle of a boss fight. But if your ammo was in an ammo bag, like the quiver or ammo pouch, your weapon would automatically search for a new stack of the same type of ammo in that bag once it ran out, which then allowed it to auto-reload for you, as long as you had more ammo of the same type. And on top of this auto-reload feature, ammo bags also gave a haste bonus. And this is where epic quivers come from. The quality of the bag used to matter a big deal, because the maximum haste bonus you could get from your ammo bag, which I might add only affected your auto shot speed, was 15%. So if you just bought a small white quality quiver from a vendor in town, it would probably only give you a 10% haste buff. But the epic quiver from the epic hunter quest chain gave the full 15%. So gearing up for a hunter required them to get one extra piece of gear in the form of a bag. Hunters were the only class in game that had to pay money to use their abilities, and had to give up one of their bag slots for a piece of their equipment. Warlocks also had soul shard bags, but they didn't give useful benefits like ammo bags did, and just had larger carrying capacity. So already, you can see some of the reasons why Blizzard felt the need to remove them, but I'll get to that part a little bit later. For now, let's talk about engineering. Ever wonder why nearly every hunter you meet is an engineer? Well, because engineers could create bullets. Good bullets too, the best bullets in the game even. But only bullets, not arrows. But you could trade in the best bullets, thorium shells, to a vendor for the arrow equivalent for free. So basically, engineers could craft the best ammo in the game. And many hunters just felt like it was a huge convenience to be able to craft the thing required to play their class. Me included, I started playing in Wrath, and even then, it was just so much more convenient to be able to make my own ammo than buy it off the auction house. Then comes the Burning Crusade, and Blizzard even finally let engineers just craft the arrows themselves, with the very first crafted arrows being the adamantite stinger. Then in Wrath of the Lich King, the trend continued. Engineers could craft both bullets and arrows the whole expansion, with even the final raid, ICC, having a rep-gated engineering schematic to craft the best bullets or arrows in the game. The Ice Blade arrows were also one of the only 2 ways of giving your arrows a little glow with every shot. But since the cost to learn how to craft these 2 ammos was pretty steep at first, buying the best ammo for your weapons from the auction house was very commonplace, and people loved to post ammo in stacks of 1 to troll the auction house. Because you see, ammo could only stack up to 200, which wasn't changed until mid-Wrath when the stack was increased to 1000. And hunters needed tons of ammo, and since it was basically the largest quantities of things one could buy from the auction house, it wasn't uncommon for people to troll the auction house by posting ammo in stacks of 1 to try to trick players into spending a lot of gold on 1 ammo, which was almost useless. You only ever wanted to buy full stacks of ammo, and I think this was also another reason it was removed. Using the default auction house interface to buy ammo was a nightmare with just how many people flooded the market with single ammo auctions, which caused pretty much
every hunter to have to be very careful when they bought ammo from the auction house. In TBC, the legendary bow that dropped from Kil'jaeden had a special effect of not needing any ammo to use, as it created its own magical arrows when it fired, making it a very loved quality of life legendary that wasn't very useful, as it was obtained from the last tier of raiding and was made useless come the new expansion. That does make me wonder if hunters with that bow still had a quiver equipped when using it though. Now let's go back to quivers and ammo pouches for a bit. For all of vanilla and TBC, ammo bags gave the hunter a bonus to auto shot speed, which made them basically a piece of gear that they had to upgrade. But in Wrath's early patch 3.1, this attack speed was removed from ammo bags and instead was just baked into auto shot baseline. And for the longest time, the auto shot tooltip would even say that it gave a 15% haste in addition to letting you auto shoot ranged weapons. With this change, the only benefit of having special bags was their increased carrying capacity for ammo and the auto load mechanic. But once Cataclysm hit and they removed ammo from the game, quivers and ammo pouches were just turned into regular bags and no longer showed up on your character, effectively removing them from the game. Now, why was ammo removed from the game? Well, like I mentioned earlier on in the video, hunters were the only class in the game who had to pay for every shot they fired, and most abilities also consumed an ammo even if their power wasn't modified by it in any way. Hunters had one more chore to deal with that other classes didn't, and it was a pretty big deal if they ignored it. Running out of ammo in the middle of a fight meant doing almost no DPS, as you had to run in and do melee damage, which was not very good. If anything, removing ammo was just the logical choice, as they didn't really need it outside of class fantasy stuff. Now, lots of hunters complained about its removal, and still do, but one of the more valid complaints about the removal of ammo was the loss of quivers and ammo pouches, since there is no way to get that look back outside of the MM artifact weapon. So for Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard announced this new exciting thing called class accessories, which would be a way to give hunters their quivers and ammo pouches back, finally, after all these years. But they wouldn't come into a later patch in Warlords, and they could even be leveled up to change their appearances. What a new, fun, and exciting thing Warlords was going to add. Now, you might be wondering, what? There's no such thing as class accessories, though. And yeah, you're right. This was one of the many things scrapped from Warlords of Draenor. Or more like Warlords of scrapped content. But seriously, there was so much thrown out from that expansion. I'll link a video at the end of this one going over most of it. But yeah, class accessories was the last we've heard of any kind of return to quivers and ammo pouches. I'd guess since MM hunters did get quivers with their artifact appearance, Blizzard just called it a day and left it as is. But I've heard rumors that Blizzard didn't abandon class accessories quite yet, and more or less put them on hold to work on artifact weapons. But I don't know how true that is. Okay, and I think that's it for as far as ammo goes. In order to give hunters a convenience that every other class had, they had to take away what made them unique. But is it really a bad thing to have a unique feature taken away when that feature in of itself was nothing but a huge chore? That's the big question, and one I don't really have a good answer for.
Many features and decisions of the Cataclysm expansion have been controversial, but WoW's third expansion was also not without its positives. Today, we're looking over 10 different things that made WoW a better game that were added in Cataclysm. And at number 10, we have Void Storage. Implemented in patch 4.3, Void Storage serves as an alternative to the traditional bank. Run by Vault Keepers, Void Storage in lore is made possible by Ethereals using Technomancy, which allows players to deposit some of their items in a pocket dimension. Originally, Void Storage had 80 slots, but that was doubled to 116 Warlords of Draenor. To access Void Storage, players must pay a 100 gold fee once per each character. Depositing items into void storage cost 25 gold in Cata, but was later lowered to 10 in WoD. Void Elves actually receive a 50% discount on transactions at void storage due to the racial passive ethereal connections. Void storage was initially almost exclusively used for transmog, but we'll get to that later. There are two main advantages to void storage. First, it can save up space in both the player's bags and the regular bank. Second, void storage is account-wide, meaning any character can access it once they have paid the 100 gold fee. However, void storage is at number 10 on this list because it has so many disadvantages as well, which result in void storage feeling pretty underwhelming and frustrating. Most of these disadvantages have to deal with the stuff you actually can put into void storage, or more accurately, stuff that you can't put into void storage. First, players can only place soulbound items into void storage. They cannot also deposit unique items, items that are stackable, or any items that are common or poor quality. Items must be also fully repaired before they can be deposited. Additionally, any items placed into the storage will lose all customizations, including enchants, gems, additional sockets, reforged stats, and creator tags on crafted items. This is because the storage system only keeps a record of the item's ID number, for the sake of technical efficiency. Finally, there are just very few void storage locations in the game. As a Dragonflight, there are only 10 in the entire game, with most being in major cities. All of these downsides quickly add up and place void storage at only number 10 on this list. Up next, number 9, we have the updates to cities. Both Stormwind and Orgrimmar received massive updates in Cataclysm, including a total revamp and additional areas in both cities being added. The Stormwind Outskirts and Cemetery were added in Stormwind, while Orgrimmar was also greatly expanded with the Valley of Honor update and now having a backdoor to Ajara. Both capitals also received little portal areas for the new Cataclysm zones, which are the Throne of Elements in Orgrimmar and Earthshrine in Stormwind. There are simply so many things to list and go over with complete revamps of both cities that we can't include them on this list. However, we did do a mini review of all these changes in the video covering the changes to Stormwind and Orgrimmar over the years, which can be found in a linked video in the description below if you want to check it out. While the city updates in Cata were great, they were more world building and in the background and largely lost the mechanics of WoW's gameplay. Of course, we appreciate them, but there are far more larger and cooler things added in Cata, so the city updates only land at number 9 on our list. And at number 8, we have another update, this time to every zone from vanilla. In part to allow old world flying, and in part to update leveling and lore, almost every single zone throughout both Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor was entirely revamped. This included new quests, new NPCs, and new flight paths. Additionally, Deathwing's edgy emo-ness radically altered the landscapes in some zones, such as Thousand Needles, and even split some zones up like the Barrens and the Cape of Stranglethorn. The sheer scope of such a task is not to be understated, and this effort was probably one of the biggest, if not the largest projects the WoW devs have ever done. In total, there were 36 zones which were updated in Cata, with 16 in Kalimdor and 20 in the Eastern Kingdoms. And all of this is, of course, in addition to the 5 new zones Cata added: Deepholm, Mount Hyjal, Tol Barad, Twilight Highlands, and Uldum. Additionally, don't forget Cata saw the introduction of goblins and worgens to the game, so Cataclysm also added the city of Kazan, the Lost Isles, and Gilneas to the game. Overall, this was an insane undertaking, and the Old World revamp definitely deserves a spot on this list. And at number 7, we have the often forgotten tabard reputation system, which was significantly expanded in Cataclysm. The tabard slot had been in the game since vanilla, but its only real function was to show off the player's achievements. This switch to rep tabard started in Wrath, but it was only for the Northrend factions. When equipped, these tabards let the player gain reputation while doing dungeons. Specifically, the player champions their cause according to the tooltip on the tabard. In Cataclysm, the old city tabards were updated and new tabards were added for the Cataclysm reps. Players no longer had to go to Northrend and complete the Argent tournament for rep tabards. Instead, players could go to their main city for whatever rep they wanted and just buy a tabard from vendors called quartermasters for a few silver. In Cata, there were 12 main rep tabards for races and cities, with 6 for each of the base races that made up the factions at the time of Cata. For Alliance, there was the Exodar tabard, which can be purchased in the Exodar, and the Stormwind tabard, which can be purchased, unsurprisingly, from Stormwind. Both the Ironforge tabard and Nomergon tabards can be purchased in Ironforge, and both the Darnassus and Gilneas tabards can be bought in Teldrassil. For Horde, the Undercity tabard can be bought in Undercity, Silvermoon tabard can be bought outside of Silvermoon, and the Thunderbluff tabard can be bought in Thunderbluff. The other 3 tabards for Orgrimmar, Darkspear, and Bilgewater Cartel could all be bought atop the Central Plateau area in Orgrimmar. Not only were these tabards great for reaching max rep with older factions, but Blizzard also introduced them for the new factions in Cataclysm. We already mentioned Gilneas and the Bilgewater Cartel, but tabards were also added for the Guardians of Hyjal, the Earthen Ring, Therazane, Ramikon, and the Wildhammer Dragonmaw clans. Cataclysm had the easiest way to get reputation in the history of the entire game, and it seems Blizzard thought it was simply too OP since they've never gone back to the tabard system of rep. What made this system so great is that it knocked out 2 birds with 1 stone. Players need to rep with factions, and they need to run dungeons to get better gear. However, the main reason this was the case back then and not today is because reputations didn't really matter that much. Nowadays, Blizzard tries to make reputations give actual useful rewards and go beyond exalted. so being able to grind it infinitely in dungeons with a tabard doesn't really fit the current rep philosophy. And at number 6, we have interactive phasing. Interactive phasing is when open world and zone changes reflect the player's actions. Usually this happens after a major quest in a zone, but in the example we'll focus on the Molten Front. When players first arrive in the Molten Front offensive in the prequel to the Firelands Raise, it's barren and has few friendly NPCs there. However, over time as the player does dailies and activities, they help establish a foothold and help Malfurion grow a tree. This tree starts out and then goes through phases and becomes a sapling and then grows larger and larger. Along the way, the players unlock new areas and quests in the Molten Front. More NPCs come and Druid army actually starts to form. While the Molten Front does have its fair share of problems, launching an all-out assault on Ragnaros and seeing the updates in the war campaign actually happen before your eyes is certainly what stuck with a lot of people. Gameplay-wise, it helps feel like the player is actually accomplishing something, and it significantly heightens the personal investment and the role-playing perspective. Seeing a real impact the player's characters have caused in the world is not only its own reward, but it keeps the player engaged in a fun, creative way and not in a doled-out, drip-fed manner. While it may seem minor, interactive phasing can also raise the stakes and storytelling within the game. For example, most Worgen players who leveled through Gilneas will probably remember that half the island slid into the sea, just after the player had spent several minutes questing through the area. Because of this new interactive phasing introduced in Cataclysm, it added a new depth to quest and immersion, and ultimately makes the player care more about the world. Speaking of the Molten Front, at number 5 we have the Firelands raid. This raid in particular was popular amongst the player base, as its final boss is Ragnaros. Ragnaros is one of WoW's most iconic villains, and this is the second time players defeat him, the first time being after he was banished from the Molten Core in Vanilla. We could spend an entire video discussing the unique boss encounters, tactics, and layouts of this raid, but most of that is beyond the scope of this video. We'll give a few examples of some of the more unique bosses, such as climbing the spider webs in the Alterac encounter, or trying to even out DPS on Lord Rylith. Shaddox is also one of the few summonable bosses in a raid in the entire game, as he only appears after clearing a certain amount of trash ads. Almost every boss in the entire raid is memorable, which is quite a feat indeed given how many instances there are in World of Warcraft. It speaks volumes that the time walking raid Blizzard introduced with Cataclysm time walking was the Firelands. Blizzard knew how much players like Firelands, and Dragon Soul is certainly a mixed bag. Blizzard could have also chosen Bastion of Twilight, but they knew most players were more fond of Firelands, and it's pretty easy to see why. We've just barely scratched the surface of the raid in all of its unique moments and mechanics and lore and loots and mounts, but suffice to say that Firelands is pretty lit. And at number 4, we have all the new races and new race class combinations added in Cataclysm. Players certainly like to customize their character, and Cataclysm gave them many new options to do so. Of course, right off the bat, most players will know the 2 new playable races were added in the game in Cataclysm, which are the Worgen for Alliance and Goblins for the Horde. When Cataclysm launched, Worgens could be played as Druid, Hunter, Mage, Priest, Rogue, Warlock, Warrior, and Death Knights. Goblins could play the same classes, but with the exception they could not play as Druids, but could play as Shamans. Many other race class combinations were also added in Cataclysm, which most players don't know. We'll start out with the Alliance. In Cataclysm, dwarves were now allowed to be mages, shamans, and warlocks. Priests, gnomes, and human hunters were also introduced in Cata. For Horde, orc mages and undead hunters were added. Trolls got 2 new classes with druids and warlocks, and Taurens could be paladins and priests. And finally, Blood Elf warriors were also added. While this may seem like a bit of a hodgepodge, Blizzard made it this easy to mostly preserve the balance amongst the classes of the 2 different factions. For instance, Worgen could be druids, so now trolls could be druids to even it out. Goblin shamans were added, so dwarf shamans were added. Dwarf mages were added, so orc mages were added. You get the idea. Overall, Cataclysm saw the most changes to the game's race class combinations, with 30 new race class combos being added. That's a lot of new animations and work and a large undertaking in of itself. The look and feel of the player's characters was much more customizable in Cataclysm, and so all the new race class combos take the 4th spot on this list. And at number 3, we have reforging. Introduced in Cata, players could talk to arcane reforges to modify a piece of gear's secondary stats. This allowed for much more customization suitable to the player's game style, and helped alleviate needless RNG runs. Reforging an item costs the same amount as its sell value. There were 2 downsides to reforging though. The first being that the 4 primary stats, agility, intellect, stamina, and strength, were not able to be reforged. The second is that no stats can be added to a piece that already had a secondary stat. That is, players could not double dip and gain 2 kinds of the same secondary stat. There were 8 secondary stats that could be reforged in Cataclysm, which included critical strike, dodge, expertise, haste, hit, mastery, parry, and spirit. Reforging was so useful, Blizzard even added a vendor and an arcane reforger on a mountain Mist of Pandaria. Mystic Birdhat and the Grand Expedition Yak was originally an arcane reforger before it became a transmogrifier. Blizzard did eventually remove the reforge system entirely from the game Worlds of Draenor, but remnants of it can be seen in the missives used to customize secondary stats in the Shadowlands and Dragon Isle professions. One cannot understate the importance of gear in WoW. Being able to more finely tune gear to niche specializations was a fine addition to the game, and one that is sorely missed. Blizzard said the reason they removed reforging was because they wanted people to be able to use their gear as soon as they got it, instead of having to use a third-party program to calculate the best way to reforge your gear to get the perfect amount of hit and stat for every other secondary stat. So they vastly simplified stats in the next expansion, even removing most gem slots and enchants. And at number 2, we have Outworld Flying. With the Old World revamp in Cataclysm came Old World Flying, making the vast expanseness of the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor much easier and faster to navigate. As we briefly mentioned earlier, a ton of new flight paths were also added, making traveling certain parts of the zone from flight paths also much easier. This was incredibly helpful for getting around the world, and worked seamlessly into making the new Cataclysm zones feel like a natural part of the continent. While there is some validity to the claim that Old World Flying reduced just how big the vanilla world felt, the usefulness of Old World Flying has so many effects that just overall make for a better experience for most players. Old World Flying made much of the Old World more accessible for the average player and encouraged exploration. This, coupled alongside the new Cataclysm quests and updates to the zones, made many Old World zones actually feel like completely different zones in their original vanilla iterations. That's not to say that each zone was better after the Cataclysm zone revamp, just that overall, many were. Old World Flying fundamentally changed WoW in its vanilla design, and the overall player experience was better for it, which is why it comes in at second place on our list. And finally, at number 1, we have Transmogrification. Although it had its fair share of problems in Cata, T-Mog was added to the game in Cataclysm, and it forever changed the game in character customization and appearance. This is the third system brought by the Ethereals, with the aforementioned Void Storage and Reforging being the other two. Although it has undergone several changes since Cataclysm, even T-Mog in its infancy completely changed WoW. With Transmogrification, players could now alter their gear's appearance to something more desirable and pleasing to them. We could make an entire video alone on the history of transmog in the game and its ramifications, but all of it started in Cataclysm. The ability to customize the appearance of a player's gear finally heralded the end of the unintentional mismatch hulking monstrosities known as clown suits. The effects of transmog can widely be felt even to this day, where some players play for the sole purpose of collecting transmog and cosmetics. Blizzard even tapped into this by creating the Trial of Style event. One simply cannot escape transmog, and it has become so common and ubiquitous in the game that it definitely deserves number 1 spot on this list. Legion was the last modern expansion which received a lot of positive feedback. But what was so different from Legion when compared to other modern expansions, from Warlords of Draenor all the way to Shadowlands? To start off, let's go over Old WoW. For the purposes of this video, everything from Mist of Pandaria and before will be considered the Old WoW, because Warlords of Draenor is when we got updated models and a lot of systems and gears that we have today. So, modern WoW comprises of 4 expansions: Warlords of Draenor, Legion, Battle for Azeroth, and Shadowlands. And of these 4 expansions, the only one with widespread love was Legion, and 2 of them were considered some of the worst expansions in the game's history. Shadowlands is definitely not on the same level as Warlords of Draenor or Battle for Azeroth, but it's not on the same level as Legion either in reverence. Its biggest praise could be that it's probably average. In Warlords of Draenor, the biggest problem with the expansion was just a lack of content. It had 2 of the best raids in WoW's history, it was probably one of the best leveling experiences in any modern expansion, and included a lot of features that more casual players really enjoyed. The biggest problem with the garrisons was that they were too useful, so that there was never a reason to actually leave them. And with missing a full raid tier, while also having one of the longest content droughts at the end of the expansion, it definitely deserves some of its infamy. Another thing people probably forget about Warlords of Draenor is that it was the expansion which pruned a lot of the old WoW. Warlords of Draenor was when a ton of classes lost abilities. It's also when socket bonuses were just straight up removed from the game, and instead it was added as a tertiary stat. Warforging became more common before they added Titan Forging, and they removed a lot of power from professions and enchants. No longer could you enchant half your gear. They instead restricted it to just a handful of slots. All the professions stopped providing little bonuses to incentivize you being able to pick whatever you wanted, and with the removal of socket bonuses and less enchanting slots, jewel crafting and enchanting were no longer the biggest moneymakers. Warlords of Draenor completely gutted customizations of characters, and it's also when they removed reforging from the game, so they went really hard on not wanting people to mess with their gear that they got from dungeons or raids at all, as they had a philosophy that they wanted you to be able to equip a piece of gear that you just got without having to sim it, or add a whole bunch of extra stuff to it later, like gems, enchants, or profession-specific things, like a tinkering from an engineer, for example. Which is funny because that never actually stopped, and in fact, simming has gotten even more advanced since Mist of Pandaria. But they went a little bit too hard at removing everything, and people were dropping the game left and right. So they did something drastic for Legion, really taking a playbook out of Mist of Pandaria's playbook, of just going bombastic with everything. In Legion, they just straight up completely redesigned some specs and classes. The Discipline Priest was changed into a completely unique style of healer. Combat Rogues were removed from the game and replaced with the Outlaw Rogue. Survival Hunters were converted into a melee spec, removing the Explosive Shot Hunter from the game. And I'm sure there's many more, but those are the biggest drastic changes I can remember. In addition, they added the first ever infinite power progression. Before Legion, it was technically possible to hit a point where you couldn't really increase the power level of your character anymore. You could get the best gear in the game, and then you were just kind of done, until the next round of expansion content came out. One of the reasons RPG mobile games can be so addicting is because a lot of them don't have power ceilings. I remember one of the browser-based games I used to play, there literally wasn't a max level. But you were restricted in how much you could farm each day due to a stamina bar. So the highest level character was whoever could pay the most money to reset that stamina bar, and it was basically just a whale-off on who could spend the most amount of money. But there is a certain appeal in always being able to progress the power level of your character, or your character in just certain ways that don't always have to be massive jumps, like maybe getting a huge upgrade from a ray drop. So the artifact weapons were kind of this. The artifact weapons did have a cap, but it was so hard to reach that it was almost an infinite power climb. It also provided a lot of really strong bonuses to your class, which we'll go over a little bit later, and they also had a lot of really cool lore things, which really resonated with people. But the biggest gameplay feature of them was the fact that it added a new thing you could farm in-game. In a normal RPG, you're done leveling once you hit max level, so the artifact weapon system essentially added more levels to grind, just replacing the word experience points with artifact power. And someone with a stronger artifact weapon was just stronger than someone else who had a lower level artifact weapon. And while artifact power wasn't very well liked, it does kind of lead into why Legion was so incredibly well liked. And the reasons are pretty simple, and almost directly related to the artifact weapon. Legion is when they release the shackles on players' power, and also when they release the shackles on lore. Warlords of Draenor was the training arc, where you have a whole bunch of weighted clothing and had to lift weights for 2 whole years, and Legion was the moment where Rock Lee drops his weights. Adding too much power to gear with gems, enchants, and profession bonuses? How about we add incredibly overpowered legendary effects to equipment? Being too conservative with lore, to the point where you have to go back in time just to experience past events? How about we just bring everyone in the past to the forefront, all at once? The Death Knight campaign directly contributed to Shadowlands' entire plot. One of the first random followers you get in the Priest Order Hall is now looking to be the new leader of the Forsaken. The dagger that Shadow Priests use was a major plot point in BFA. One of the artifact weapons just straight up destroyed a planet. Another one was a fan favorite rumor for years, and was used in all of the promotional materials as one of the weapons you'd be able to wield. And they were powerful too. I made a video on some of the hardest hitting abilities in WoW's history, and a couple of them were just straight up artifact weapon abilities. That's not even mentioning the legendaries. You had stuff like the Mantle of the Master Assassin, which could just straight up give you a 100% crit chance for 6 seconds. Legendaries that gave you extra talents, allowing you to spam use abilities that have cooldowns, or just adding extra buttons or charges to spells and abilities you already had, changing rotation completely. And some of the artifact abilities themselves were so good, they were added to the base class after the expansion. In addition to the lore for the weapons and campaigns just being packed full of major, important past characters, we got to go fight the biggest bad guys in the Warcraft universe itself on their home turf, thanks to the help of the Titans, who are some of the biggest, most important good guys we've constantly been hearing about throughout the history of Warcraft lore. You can't really have something that goes more over the top than that. Super powerful weapons, crazy impactful legendaries, lore that was completely over the top, in addition to still having tier set bonuses, the introduction of the Mythic Plus system, and even the widespread love of hard solo content that was the Mage Tower. It was the biggest and brightest expansion we've had in modern WoW, and then it all came crashing to a halt in BFA. Artifact weapons were too strong, so they introduced Azerite, which was like a baby version of it. You could still infinitely grind it out, but the bonuses were minor in comparison to what the artifact weapon provided, and simply just allowed you to use your gear, rather than providing a whole bunch of neat extra benefits. The lore was a lot more small scale too. We went from hanging out with some of the most important people in Warcraft history, to hanging out with some random pirates or trolls that we've never heard of before. There was also no tier set bonuses, no bombastic legendaries. All you were left with was the empty feeling from losing the temporary power-up that was Legion. Although, they can't really have a Legion-like extravaganza every expansion. Wrath of the Lich King was like the Legion of the classic era. They finally released the restraints they'd been playing under since Classic and TBC, and just went all out with the classes. The first patch of Wrath of the Lich King was probably the most unbalanced the game has ever been, with just how powerful some classes were, including the new Death Knights, who had abilities like a dot which would passively consume hots while they did damage to their target, an AoE which passively feared you if you try to get out of it, and of course the ability to come back to life if you actually manage to kill them, on top of their 1 minute cooldown 50% damage reduction, or their 5-second immunity to spells. Healing in Wrath of the Lich King was so over the top that they still use it as a benchmark of what they don't want healers to be able to do in the modern era, where the best way to heal was to literally spam your highest mana using abilities non-stop, because your mana was essentially infinite, and mechanics were designed around you having an infinite amount of mana. That's why in Cataclysm, when they gutted all of the Wrath over-the-topness, it wasn't very well received as the previous expansion, because they went a little bit too hard in the other direction. Mists of Pandaria was them going back to that. Mists is when pretty much every class could do everything. It was the culmination of classes getting new abilities with every expansion for 5 expansions, without them ever removing abilities from the previous expansions. There were so many new abilities that classes had that just accumulated over time, that everyone could do pretty much everything. Every class had some kind of major DPS cooldown, some kind of form of crowd control, some gap closer, some snare, a raid cooldown, and if by chance you were missing something, a druid could just symbiosis you to gain whatever you might be lacking, as the tables for what symbiosis could do was more in-depth and probably designed than the entire conduit system. Mists of Pandaria wasn't very well liked at the time, but it is definitely another over-the-top expansion when it comes to player power, which is why they had to remove so much of it in Warlords of Draenor. So World of Warcraft kind of has a system where they go all out with one expansion, and then completely reel it back in with the very next expansion for the long-term health of the game. If they never had the ability pruning in WoD and just kept adding new baseline abilities with every new expansion, then every class would be completely homogenized by now. You could basically play whatever you wanted and be good at everything. Now, that style of gameplay definitely has its own appeal, but it does make things kind of hard to balance when every class has 100 different abilities. So, after having a bombastic expansion in Legion, they then reined things in hard with BFA. It seems like they were ready to have another overpowered expansion afterwards. Since, here's how it seems like it was going. Wrath was the overpowered expansion to culminate early Classic WoW, to then have the cooldown in Cataclysm, with it ramping back up again in Mists of Pandaria, then a cooldown in Warlords of Draenor, and then going full throttle in Legion. So, going by that pattern, Shadowlands should have been the bombastic new expansion, going all out. Except, they didn't really go far enough. Shadowlands definitely tried to go for big lore moments, but they definitely did not attempt to go for big player power moments. And even the lore isn't as grand as it was in Wrath of the Lich King, Mists of Pandaria, or Legion. Wrath of the Lich King is probably #1 favorite when it comes to players' final boss. Mists of Pandaria added so much lore to the game, it's probably the most influential lore expansion ever added. As well as we still deal with things that happened in Mists of Pandaria in the modern era. And Legion, of course, had us fighting the Legion and Titans with planet-destroying weapons and spaceships. BFA was a nice breather of an expansion. Shadowlands should have been even crazier than Legion, with everyone going to the afterlife. Instead, it's a lot more tame, and they're trying to play things a little bit too safe. Although it's still only the first half of the expansion, so who knows, it could go off the rails later, probably not though. But that does allow us to go straight back into the original point of the video. Why was Legion the best expansion of modern WoW? Because it was the last expansion where players got to be overpowered, and the lore was completely off the rails. The next 2 expansions afterwards were too balanced and too on the rails, even though current WoW is literally in the afterlife. However, because they've had 2 expansions in a row where players were kind of on the rails, that leads them to easily allowing another Legion-like expansion afterwards. Although we really should have been in it right now with Shadowlands. While Legion fell victim of some polarizing design decisions, its raid content is still highly regarded as some of the best in the entire game. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the most unique and memorable raid mechanics released during WoW's 6th expansion. And at number 7, we have Sonaris and his Nightmare Brambles. Sonaris was the penultimate boss of Legion's first raid, the Emerald Nightmare. One of his more simple-sounded abilities is called Nightmare Brambles. This ability spawns a circle of roots next to a random player, and after a short while, these roots will start to chase the targeted player through the arena, creating more and more roots in its path. Coming into contact with either the chasing circle or the roots it left behind in its trail will deal damage to the player and root them. So what the player had to do was kite the brambles out of the raid. making sure the trails didn't block any important routes or hit other players. After that was done, one of the players with an immunity had to run through the routes on the ground, thus clearing them and making sure the raid had enough space to continue the fight. What made this rather basic mechanic unique? There was no indicator which player was targeted by the chasing circle. And as if this wasn't hard enough to adapt to a game that is mostly about tracking mechanics by using add-ons, the routes also swapped targets randomly. None so far has been able to map out the pattern of this ability, making it one of the few things in WoW that is not trackable by anyone and fully random. But because Nightmare Brambles are on their own fairly simple, and wouldn't be remembered by most players if they were tracked by add-ons, they only place at the bottom of this list. Staying in the Emerald Nightmare, at number 6 on this list we have the final boss of the raid, Xavius, and his Nightmare Corruption. At the beginning of the fight, a bar will appear on the bottom of the player's screen. This bar indicates the level of Nightmare Corruption individual players are inflicted with. This Nightmare Corruption interacted in multiple ways with players throughout the fight, and filled up whenever a player was hit by these boss's abilities, something that was unavoidable for some of them. After a player reached 33 Corruption, so-called Dread Abominations will start to create AoE damage zones on the ground, forcing the player to move. The Dread Abominations themselves were untargetable, but their spawn area will indicate where the next damage marker was going to appear. The important part was that these zones were fully unique to the player that saw them. The same goes for 66 Corruption, at which point small damage circles will spawn much more frequently in addition to the big ones. At 100 Corruption, the player would descend into madness, gaining a massive damage and healing buff for 20 seconds. After the 20 seconds were over, the player would die. But there was a twist. You see, at 2 points in the fight, 95% and 60%, the Spirit of the Green Dragon aspect Ysera would put the physical bodies of half the raid to sleep, marking their locations and allow them to fight as a dreaming simulacrum. When a player in the dream would die, they would instead just wake up, getting repositioned to where their physical bodies fell asleep. This process also did reset health, mana, and most importantly, all cooldowns the players were using during their time in the dream. What made this mechanic unique? The second life and the cooldown reset that the players in the dream were granted meant that those who were put to sleep weren't just responsible to protect players in the waking world from corruption, they were actively encouraged to do so. Not only would they prevent their fellow raid members outside the dream from dying, the damage buff at 100 corruption in addition to the reset of all the players' cooldowns created massive damage windows. Keep in mind that this was during Legion, a time where Shadow Priests had access to Surrender to Madness, famously the most overpowered cooldown of all time, that killed the user when it ends. The fact that certain boss abilities were voluntarily soakable by players sometimes even resulted in multiple players fighting for an ad soak so they could increase the corruption faster. For instance, to line up their cooldowns with the damage window at 100 corruption. While we had some revive mechanics since then, none of them reset cooldowns or only affected half the raid at a time. But those factors alone aren't enough to compete with the higher numbers on this list, so Xavius' corruption only ranks at number 6. Going from the first raid in Legion to the last, we have Varimathras, the 8th boss of Antorus, the Burning Throne. Varimathras' entire fight revolved around the interplay of two different abilities, Misery and Alone in the Dark. Misery is a fairly straightforward debuff that increases physical damage taken and prevents healing on a player for 7 seconds each time the player takes shadow damage. Alone in the Dark causes Varimathras to deal shadow damage to players whenever they aren't in 8-yard range of an allied player. Additionally, on Heroic and upwards, there was an area-wide effect that changed every 2 minutes, dealing a different kind of damage every second. In the first minutes, it just dealt fire damage for the healers to deal with. The second damage type was frost damage, and applied at 40% on the entire raid. The third damage type was fell damage, slowing down to deal damage every 5 seconds, but increasing in severity by 50% each time it dealt damage. And the fourth and final damage type was shadow, instantly affecting the entire raid with Misery, making them immune to being healed and acted as the soften rage for the encounter. Now, what makes this mechanic unique? Despite the easy to understand premise of the abilities, the encounter was quite challenging, forcing players to act as a unit and make sure no one gets left behind. For instance, one of the boss abilities, Stark Fissures, would create void zones under 3 players in the raid, forcing the entire raid to move from one side of the boss to the other, while making sure to stay within 8 yards of each other. This heavily punished ill-timed uses of movement abilities like Blink, especially while the 40% slow was active, because players could easily end up too far ahead of the raid. In the Heroic and Mythic versions, the boss is also able to cast the ability Necrotic Embrace. This ability would mark one player in the raid, dealing shadow damage to them after 6 seconds, applied Misery, and spreading to anyone within 10 yards, and thus wiping the raid immediately. Not only did the marked player have to move out of the raid, the healers also needed to make sure he was topped off before he could leave the raid, as doing so would make him immune to receiving healing before taking the high damage from Necrotic Embrace. Moving as a unit wasn't exactly new to WoW's encounter design, but Varimathras was by far the most claustrophobic iteration of this style of tightly choreographed dance fights. And number 4, we have Kil'jaeden, Finding Illidan. Still regarded as one of the hardest bosses in WoW's lifetime, we have the final boss of the Tomb of Sargeras, Legion's 3rd raid. This encounter had 5 different stages, 3 phases where you would actively fight the boss, and 2 intermissions. In each phase, the boss would gain more abilities added upon the already existing set of mechanics that players had to deal with. But for this list, we'll look at the one point in the fight that doesn't contain any of the abilities used elsewhere during the fight. The second intermission of the fight right before the third and final phase of the encounter. As he transitioned, Kil'jaeden would disappear and multiple Shadow Soul adds would spawn within the area. Shortly afterwards, the players would be engulfed in darkness, which massively limited the player's viewing distance and prevented them from healing or dealing damage. Simultaneously, the Shadow adds will start chain casting destabilizing Shadow Soul, dealing damage to the entire raid. The darkness effect was able to be lessened by finding Illidan in the arena, who randomly spawned right as the phase began. The players need to walk within the circle around him, which applied a refreshable dot on them, enabling the ability to see through the darkness and restore the capability of healing or dealing damage. After all adds had been killed, the phase would end and Kil'jaeden would be attackable once again. What made this mechanic unique? While the players had to deal with limited visibility from being enveloped by darkness, the UI elements of the game weren't affected by anything. This made the minimap and its ping system extremely valuable for coordinating within the raid. Once one player was able to find Illidan, they would just be able to spam click on themselves in the minimap, noticing the rest of the raid of Illidan's position. Additionally, hunters could bring a massive advantage for this fight. You see, hunters have the unique skill to track most creature types on their minimap, one of them being humanoids. And Illidan did count as a humanoid. So what hunters could do is just start clicking on the minimap as soon as Illidan's indicator would appear on there. This enabled the entire raid to move straight to him and thus reduce the time in complete darkness significantly. While Illidan's position was important, the players also had to track the positions of the Shadow Soul adds. While the dot they could gain by being close to Illidan would reduce the darkness, it wouldn't completely remove it, thus making it still be necessary to seek out the adds scattered across the arena. Blizzard so far hasn't tried anything like this again. This might be because Kil'jaeden's encounter was brutally difficult, making it controversial in the eyes of certain parts of the WoW community. But its uniqueness in the field of intermissions makes it stand out regardless of its difficulty, thus earning a place on this list. And at number 3, we have Antoran High Command, the Pod. Returning to the final rated expansion, we have the third boss of Antorus, the Antoran High Command. The Antoran High Command is made up of 3 different bosses that share one health bar: Admiral Shivarix, Chief Engineer Ishkar, and General Eridus. While only one of them was active and damageable, the other 2 are inside of their command pod, where they would gain specific abilities to influence the encounter from a distance. While outside of the pod, the 3 bosses only had one shared move, a tank hit that increased physical damage taken and forces a tank swap. While inside of the pod, each boss would gain one shared and one unique ability. This shared ability was called Chaos Pulse, dealing damage to random raid members and increasing their damage taken by 15 seconds. The unique abilities for each of these bosses are as follows. While Chief Engineer Ishkar was in the pod, he would periodically spawn entropic mines close to random players. These mines would take a couple of seconds to become active, after which they would detonate on contact, dealing heavy damage to the player who touched them and applying a stacking dot on the raid. General Eridus' pod ability was called Summon Reinforcements and did exactly that, spawning in a number of adds that either casted an interruptible pyroblast or bladestorm across the arena, needing to be avoided. The last pod, piloted by Admiral Sivriax, granted her the ability Fusillade, a massive raid-wide AoE that increased in damage each time she would use it, creating a softened rage for the encounter. Now, what made this mechanic unique? One boss being active at all time meant that one pod was also accessible for players to enter, gaining access to 2 abilities. One shared one, Chaos Pulse, that dealt damage to and increased the damage they took, and one that resembled the ability of the original pilot. The ability for each pod was specifically designed to hard counter one of the pod abilities of the other 2 bosses. The Admiral's pod ability allowed the usage of Withering Fire, a controllable burst AoE that dealt massive damage to summon demons and increased their damage taken, while the Engineer's pod was able to place a shield generator, which upon activation would create a damage reduction zone against the damage of Fusillade. Players in the General's pod were able to call in disruptor beacons that would pulse the disruption field for 7 seconds, interrupting enemy spellcasters and slowing them down, while also getting rid of entropic mines. This resulted in a fight that was built around pre-planning the encounter well, placing multiple shield generators in advance around the room and smartly clearing out the mines while having access to disruptor beacon. And all of this is done from a static vehicle. And at number 2, we have Iminar the Soul Hunter, the 6th boss of Antorus. To understand Iminar the Soul Hunter as a boss fight, we first need to take a look at the arena he's fought in. Behind the platform the fight starts on is a long bridge and a second platform mirroring the starting one. Every 33%, or 20% of mythic, Iminar becomes immune to all damage and jumps across the bridge, scattering multiple different traps along the bridge and starts a channel. While this channel is active, he hurls burning balls across the bridge, rolling in a straight line. If he isn't interrupted within 2 minutes, the raid wipes. Now, what makes this mechanic unique? Iminar's bridge is a death trap of choices. Stasis traps that stun players for 8 seconds, pulse grenades that knock back all players hit, causing them to hit more traps or fall off the bridge, and sharpenal mines and blast wires dealing massive damage to either the player who stepped on them or the entire raid. All of this while the players have to dodge the burning balls coming towards them. But the tricky part was, the raid had to cross the bridge multiple times and traps did not despawn. So each time the boss crossed the bridge, a new layer of traps would be placed upon the last, increasing the difficulty of each intermission massively. One silver lining the players had was the fact that some classes were able to use an immunity and run in front of the raid, clearing at least some of the traps in the way to carve out a path for the gauntlet. Imanar's Gauntlet might be one of the most interesting and well-executed mechanics Blizzard introduced in Legion, but it doesn't come close to the most unique boss they made in Legion, or even the entire game. Undefeated the number 1 spot is the 9th boss of Legion's second raid, the Nighthold Grand Magister Elisande. Elisande also appears on our top 10 interesting raid mechanics in World of Warcraft list I did a couple of years ago. Given she is a time mage, it makes sense that she pops up again years later. But let's take a close look at the fight. 2 things that were important. Firstly, there were 2 adds, a purple and a blue one. Both would create a bubble when it died. The blue bubble would slow everything it touches for a set time. The purple one did the opposite. Secondly, 2 times after Elisande reaches 10% health, she resets herself in time back to full health and leaves behind an echo of herself. The echo will repeat each ability she cast at the position she held while it was casted the first time. For the first health bar, the echo abilities were a ring of damage that Elisande pulls towards her, and some void zones that grow smaller whenever a player took a damage tick from them. Once she resets herself for the first time, her ability set would change. Now, the players had to spread lasers and catch orbs from the sky, the latter of which would also echo into the last phase. Speaking of which, in the last phase, players would be afflicted by 2 different kinds of debuffs. Permulative Torment would be taken for rampant damage, while Conflexive Burst would deal massive raid damage after 30 seconds. What made the mechanic unique, the speed up and slow down zone, as well as the echo. You see, everything the bubbles touch would be altered. Segments of the ring from the first phase would slow down or speed up depending on what bubble they touched and stayed altered in the following echoes. And for the players, not only was their attack, cast, and movement speed changed, but also the speed of which cooldowns were covered and hots and dots ticked. The latter was extremely important, because being slowed down was vital to soak the void zones, as healing them with the normal damage tick rate was almost impossible. And for the last phase, not making sure the raid-wide damage from Conflex's burst was spread out was lethal and almost certainly meant a wipe. In addition, good players were able to abuse the gains they received from the speed-up zone nearly permanently throughout the entire fight, creating an extremely enjoyable environment for re-clears and farm raids. This resulted in time mechanics being well liked by the community to this day, leading to Blizzard reusing similar ideas multiple times, most recently in the Dawn of the Infinite Mega Dungeon and Dragonflight. This results in Elisande's time manipulation taking the first spot on this list, by cementing a legacy in the expansions to come. Was Battle for Azeroth really as bad as people remember? This is one of the few expansions that was universally hated for a ton of reasons. However, I think most of these reasons might be a little bit overblown, and I can kind of explain why people hated Battle for Azeroth so much in one short, simple term. Azerite armor. Azerite armor, as a mechanic, was so bad, it pretty much shaped the terrible first impressions of the expansion from the get-go. Azerite armor was supposed to replace pretty much all of the fun new gear progression systems we had in the past. It was a series of 3 pieces of armor that you would have 2 rings, which would give you bonuses to your main spec, depending on its traits that you could find on these pieces of armor. And if you had a proper level in your necklace, which was just a pure stat stick, you'd be able to unlock all the rows in order to fully be able to use your armor. And being able to actually farm out all these rows actually required a pretty high neck level. So you had to do a lot of grinding in game in order to be able to use your pieces of equipment. Now, on surface level, this doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. The only reason this was controversial was because of the drastic level of power differences it had from the previous expansion. In the previous expansion, you had artifact weapons, 2 legendaries, and tier set bonuses. And the artifact weapon had more traits on it by itself than all 3 of your Azerite pieces combined, especially when you count in the upgrades you got throughout the expansion, like the Netherlight Crucible. On top of that, you also had the legendaries, which provided additional huge power increases, where many classes and specs were balanced around their strongest legendary. And you also had tier set bonuses, which everybody who plays the game should know adds an extra layer of power to your character. In comparison, the Azerite armor was like being able to pick what your tier set bonuses were. However, it was kind of worse in a respect, because sometimes the tier set bonuses were really good, and most of the time the 4 set bonus could be absolutely amazing for certain classes. But the way the Azerite armor worked made it so they couldn't really make any of the traits as good as a proper tier set bonus, because all the traits had to be made with the intention that they could be stacked. It was possible to have 3 of the same traits amongst all your 3 pieces of equipment, so you couldn't really do something that changed your spec too drastically, because it had to do something that could be stacked on top of itself. Now, despite this, there were a couple of Azerite traits where you only took it once because there was a specific trait that did not stack, like increasing the duration of Attunement by 2 seconds, but for the most part, they were made with the intention of getting to stack with each other. so they generally just provided some kind of number increase to one of your abilities. And because of this design choice, a lot of them were kind of boring. Some of the best tier set bonuses could drastically change how you played your class. Legendaries from Legion could completely warp your rotation around them, and the artifact weapons themselves give you brand new abilities to push with a couple of other extra abilities that grant you sometimes, and a ton of passives that just made you stronger in other areas. So in comparison of having Azerite armor, which gave you boring abilities, replacing all this fun stuff you used to have, and was meant to be the only thing you had for the entire expansion, it's no wonder the system was pretty much panned from the very beginning. There was massive amounts of feedback to change Azerite armor to just really anything else, and Blizzard's response was just to basically ignore most of that feedback. When the expansion launched and the entire player base finally got to try out Azerite armor for themselves that all the streamers were complaining about in the beta, they too got to see firsthand just how much of a mess it was. What Azerite armor could have been was a system about picking your own tier set bonuses. It was actually kind of hard to get Azerite pieces in the first place. And the Azerite armor you got would only give you an option of 2, maybe 3 traits to pick for your major abilities, because each Azerite piece shared all of its traits amongst all of your specs, so you basically got to choose if you wanted the generic trait for the Azerite piece, or your spec-specific trait. And if the piece of gear you had didn't have your particular spec-specific trait, then you just had to find a completely new piece of gear that might have it. However, Azerite armor gets even worse, because if you did have a piece of gear that had the trait you wanted, and you got a better, higher item level piece of that Azerite gear, there's a good chance you wouldn't be able to use it because of your Azerite necklace level system. The higher the item level of the Azerite gear, the more levels you need on your Azerite necklace in order to use all of those traits. Even if it was the exact same piece of equipment, just a higher item level, you wouldn't be able to use all the traits on that piece of equipment that you previously had been using with no problem, because there was just an arbitrary lock in having to grind out your necklace levels in order to use your gear. So it was an entirely common scenario for people to not be able to use their new pieces of equipment, using lower level pieces of Azerite armor, simply because they couldn't use the actual traits on their new armor yet. And it gets even worse, because the traits would not reset if you change your spec. So you needed different Azerite armor for all of your different specs. And resetting the traits in order to change them to a different spec was not free, and in fact incredibly expensive if you did it too often within a short amount of time. Which was just a mind-boggling decision by most players, as why would they gate it so hard when you only had 2 options to pick from anyway? It's almost like Blizzard was just incredibly afraid of the power they gave players in the previous expansion that they dialed it back way too much with Azerite armor, and were completely shocked when they found that people didn't like how weak they were, and how many arbitrary restrictions they had for seemingly no reason. And as further proof of how bad this was, Blizzard basically abandoned the mechanic entirely after the first major patch, where you still had Azerite armor for the rest of the expansion, but they made it so much easier to deal with, you could basically ignore it to an extent. They made Azerite armor a lot easier to obtain, they created a currency that allowed you to actually target specific pieces you needed, they gave you an extra row of traits, and made it so it was almost impossible to not have the highest level necklace to use all of your pieces of Azerite armor immediately, but still made it expensive to reforge for no reason. However, even though Blizzard made it a lot easier to deal with Azerite armor, it was still in the game and still wasn't all that fun, which was a major problem because World of Warcraft players love their gear more than anything. There are some players who don't even care about raids or dungeons, and simply do them because they just want gear. There are whole secondary markets of people paying massive amounts of gold to get carry through the highest level of content just so they can get better gear. So if Blizzard is going to mess up a feature, they definitely don't want to mess up the gear. And if anything, Battle for Azeroth proves why you should never make that mistake again. Because if it wasn't for the massive failure of Azerite armor, people probably would have liked BFA a lot more. Because in this same expansion we got Azerite armor, we also had one of the best additions to the game in the form of the Essence system, which was created as a direct response to how bad Azerite armor was, and created a whole system of extra abilities you could choose from that could meaningfully change your gameplay, with extra passives you could pick, which could also be changed in any rest area without having to pay a whole bunch of money, and without taking away from your other pre-established pieces of armor, as it was just built inside your necklace, which wasn't doing anything anyway. You could pick an active ability that gave you an extra AoE, extra single target, extra raid healing cooldown, extra defensives, or just big damage against mobs in the open world. There were a lot of different active abilities you could choose from that you could change depending on what kind of content you were doing. I know I loved the Breath of the Dying Essence, since it could let you chain one-shot mobs while doing dailies if the damage was high enough to kill the target. And also I loved the Well of Existence passive, since it stored all of my overhealing and turned it into extra healing when needed, which was nice on a class that was built towards massive amounts of overhealing. And then there was Essence of the Focusing Iris, which I don't think was really BIS for any class, but was easily one of the coolest looking actives they've added to the game, since it's basically just a giant Kamehameha. Not only was all this a great response to Azerite armor being bad, it was one of the best borrowed power systems ever added. If we were to compare all of the borrowed power mechanics added in modern WoW, I can't think of anything that could topple the Essences. It's almost crazy how overshadowed they were, but to be fair, they weren't perfect either. Blizzard was hell-bent on giving people random grinds during this time period. It made getting the tier 3 abilities require a bit of legwork to accomplish, and did not make them account-wide, so it made grinding them out on alt an unnecessary pain. Although, to add on to that, they did have this unique mechanic where you can grind even further to get a cosmetic upgrade tier 4 of the abilities, which did not increase its power, but did make them look a lot cooler. If anything, it'd be great if they had more grinds to get cooler looking versions of your default spells. This particular extra grind for cosmetic spells is one I'm sure everyone can get behind. This was just an excellent mechanic the BFA had, which isn't the only thing that BFA excelled in, because BFA also had one of the best raids the game ever introduced, the Battle for dazar'alor. BFA was a full expansion with 4 raid tiers across 5 different raids. You had Ulduar as the intro raid, Battle for dazar'alor and Crucible Storms for tier 2, Eternal Palace for tier 3, and finally Ny'alotha for the final raid of the expansion. And while the other raids were fine, Battle for dazar'alor was easily the best of all of them. In fact, I'd say Battle for dazar'alor is a top 5 raid. Out of the 29 different raid tiers, I think it's up there alongside Ulduar or ICC. Let's set the stage for Battle for dazar'alor. The entire expansion was sold as a faction conflict, and there were a ton of quests on both sides in order to set up this eventual raid. As the Horde, you hear the Alliance is attacking far in the north, and they sent a huge army there that you have to go stop. So you help fight with the Zandalare forces through the Alliance forces, cutting your way through these desperate soldiers until you finally meet the gigantic navy at the shore, only to find out that it was all an illusion. The soldiers you were fighting were just sent there to die in order to sell the fact that they might have a giant army there waiting. But actually, they were in the middle of sieging the capital that very moment, so you had to run all the way back as quickly as possible only to find the city already being attacked. Then when you get inside, you find that King Rashtakan has already been killed. And the only thing you can do is learn about how it happened through someone retelling the story, and then chase after Jaina out in the open seas. And it had an amazing mechanic of actually changing your race to the opposite faction so you could be better immersed in the story, while also changing the dialogues that the NPC said for both sides in order to better sell how some sides tell the stories differently. The Horde would change into Alliance in order to play the story of attacking the capital, and the Alliance would turn into the Horde in order to play the part of the Horde going after Jaina afterwards. And then it all culminates in a final battle out in the open sea. You chase Jaina out into the sea where she turns around and just freezes everything in place. And what happens next is just an amazing boss fight. I still remember when I heard about Dragonsoul back in Cataclysm, and how it was a very thematic raid with all of its boss fights. You would go to the top of a tower, jump on a gunship to chase after Deathwing, parachute onto his back, and then finally beat him into the middle of the Maelstrom. And while all of this sounded cool in theory, when you actually did it, you had some of the worst fights ever made. The gunship battle, which you were chasing after Deathwing on, was one of the most bug-filled fights I've ever had the displeasure of doing. The spine of Deathwing is just one of the most hated fights ever made, and the final fight is one of the most disappointing final bosses ever, which is still kind of used as a benchmark to compare other disappointing final bosses to. They just really did not nail the thematic nature of the bosses, because they tried too much to make them thematic, and not enough to make them an actual good boss fight. So, when I first heard about the Jaina fight being another thematic boss fight, I was kind of skeptical, which probably made me like the fight even more when I felt that they totally nailed it. The fight starts off on a boat where you're fighting Jaina and her marines. You can DPS down the marines like normal, or you can have your priest mind control them and have them jump off the boat, which I thought was a really neat mechanic to add to a boss fight, because generally they don't let you do things like that in boss fights, even though it totally makes sense from a thematic point of view. At any point that you're fighting Jaina, if your group tries to bloodless, Jaina will actually ice block for the duration of it, like a smart character would do that knows their enemy's tactics. So you'd have to wait for the opportune moment of the fight in order to pop bloodless in order to fight other things that were in Jaina or to interrupt mechanics. When Jaina freezes the boat in the ocean and runs to the middle, and you have to chase after her, you're constantly getting stacks of a frostbite debuff, which makes sense because you're fighting on a gigantic slab of ice created by an enemy. And you have to warm yourself by going to flame barrels, which also makes sense because you were just on a boat earlier that would realistically have those nearby. When Jaina gets too much to handle and tries to freeze everyone, you have to run back to the boat in order to free a major NPC who can help you deal with Jaina's instant kill attacks. And in the final phase of the fight, you're just trying to burn her down before everybody freezes to death, where she ice blocks and teleports away at the end. I'm still not really sure how they nailed it, but I can't remember the last time I've had so much fun progressing on a boss fight, because it was full of a whole bunch of multiple layers that had you moving all over the place, and doing a lot of unique things where you were basically just fighting an ice mate. And also it helped that it wasn't overly long, which is usually the case for mid-expansion final boss fights, and not the final ones. So if anything, the fact that it was the second raid of the expansion probably worked in its favor of not making the fight too long to overstay its welcome, and be exactly the right length to be a masterpiece of a boss fight. And in fact, to this day, the Jaina final fight is my personal favorite boss fight. The rest of the raid was also excellent, with the mini final boss in the middle where you're fighting King Rashtakan, who's obviously not as hard as Jaina, but fitting for a major lore character when you're defeating it. Now, obviously, one raid doesn't make an entire expansion, but it's really hard to state just how good Battle for dazar'alor was. After the raid, we had Mechagon and Nazjatar, two brand new max level zones to explore, full of treasures and rares and certain mechanics. On Mechagon, you had a really good trinket that you could modify by putting gems inside of it in order to have the effects that you wanted. The best effect was a laser that did so much damage that it was nerfed multiple times, and for a while was one of the best legacy trinkets you could use in time-walking content. The laser beam is easily one of the most overpowered trinket effects ever made. Over in Nazjatar, you had a gigantic zone full of all kinds of hidden treasures to find, like a secret quest chain where you had to go around and trade all kinds of different items to different NPCs in order to unlock a mount. Plus, they had scheduled PvP events in the zone and just a ton of things to grind out if you wanted 100% all the achievements and collectibles. And back in Mechagon, there were these little workstations around the zone which could give you a zone buff that could help you kill things quicker or just get around faster, as well as unlocking the collectibles from all the hidden quests, rares, and events. And yes, there were hidden quests in the zone, which was a really unique thing for modern WoW because they don't really make hidden quests anymore. In order to 100% the zone, you had to find out how to get these hidden quests, which could actually take a while because you did need to do a bunch of specific things in order to unlock them. And if you weren't a collector and didn't care about all this hidden stuff, the actual power upgrades you got from the zone were pretty straightforward and required minimal effort to get the full benefits of them. If anything, I'm kind of sad they don't do this more often. In fact, I don't think they've ever done this again. In Shadowlands, they had a max level zone for all three major patches. You had the Maw, Korthia, and Zerath Mortis. In Legion, they did have Argus as a gigantic zone you unlocked at the end of the expansion. But, to be honest, it was just a glorified world quest zone. The fact that Nazjatar and Mechagon were unique in their mechanics and very separate from each other just made the max level zones so much more fun to play in during the expansion. If you got bored of Mechagon, you could just hop over to Nazjatar and start doing dailies there. And it was just a completely different feel because of how differently the mechanics of the zones functioned. In Argus, even though you did have 3 different zones, they all had the exact same zone mechanic, so it was basically like 3 different sceneries on top of the same thing. They tried something new with Mechagon and Nazjatar, and the community largely loved it. It's kind of hard to explain just how negative the community perception of the game was at the time. However, even in this incredibly hostile environment of BFA hate, people agreed that these 2 new zones were fun and they really liked the idea of having both of them to play at the same time. If they only just added one or the other at a time, probably people wouldn't like them very much, but the fact they added them both at the same time was what made it a huge W for Battle for Azeroth. Which is a shame that all of these great things are just overshadowed by Azerite armor. Azerite armor is just the black stain on the expansion. It was only really terrible for the very beginning, but has kind of painted the legacy, the branding of Battle for Azeroth. Or is it really fair to just blame everything on a failed gearing system? I'd argue the gearing system is just as important as I said it was earlier in the video, but there also was a lot of other incredibly mediocre things about the expansion, which definitely added fuel to the arguments against it. While the battle for dazar'alor, essences, the dual inclusion of Mechagon and Nazjatar were well liked, there were plenty of other things added to expansion that were deservedly also just bad and not well liked. Namely, the island expeditions and the war fronts. Island expeditions were sold as an exploratory thing where you go to an island, search for treasures, and fight enemy faction who's trying to stop you from doing this. What ended up being was an AoE grindfest, where you just go around and gather as many mobs as possible and then AoE them down, in order to finish as quickly as you could. Because island expeditions were one of the best ways to grind out your necklace level, and many hardcore players hated them by the end of the expansion for just how many they had to do. Warfronts were sold as a Warcraft 3 style mode, where you could collectively choose which minions and bases to build in order to eventually push into the enemy keep. What it actually ended up being was an AFK simulator, where it was so hard to lose that there wasn't really a big incentive to try, other than maybe winning a little bit earlier. Because even if you did try as hard as you couldn't actually win that quickly because there was built-in timers restricting you from how fast you could accomplish things. And these 2 features were some of the main selling points of the expansion. Island expeditions were supposed to be a brand new mode that would have you exploring all these new locations and getting treasures, and while it was full of collectibles, they were not fun at all to do. And warfronts were just kinda boring. Where the best way to do them was just to put on a good Netflix show on your second monitor and just kinda mindlessly kill things and collect wood and minerals for when the game would eventually let you push the enemy keep. It was so bad that they never added the barrens or Silvermoon warfronts they had in the game files, and never tried a PvP mode like they said they might. And on the flip side, the only good thing that BFA had were its raiding content, Mythic Plus, Essence System, the dual inclusion of Mechagon and Nazjatar, and the allied races. Although let me rewind a little bit on this. During BFA, Blizzard tried to iterate on the Mythic Plus system they'd introduced in the previous expansion, where they introduced seasonal affixes that would be applied to Mythic Plus dungeons of levels 10 and higher, and they were actually a big success. The affix of the final tier BFA had this mechanic where you would fight these minions of the old gods at points throughout the dungeon, and where they died in the other realm would spawn a portal that would take you back to the dungeon. And you could use these portals in the other realm in order to skip mobs, which was an amazing design choice because, at the time, a key meta in Mythic Plus dungeons was how to properly skip mob packs. Because a lot of the times in high-level Mythic Plus dungeons, the trash mobs were more dangerous than the actual bosses themselves. And you would strategically skip ones that were too hard or just not worth the effort, and only deal with the weakest ones that could fill the meter in order to complete the dungeon. And the meta at the time was just to have a bunch of rogues in order to skip those packs, to the point where there was a lot of contention in the pugging Mythic Plus dungeon community, where it almost felt like you were required to have at least one rogue so you could skip certain mob packs. And this entire thing was completely solved with this affix. That just lets you skip whatever you wanted, just as long as you position the portals where you thought they would be best. It was such a successful mechanic that I'm sure many people are sad they didn't bring it back further for any other seasonal affixes, or just added it as a default mechanic in Mythic Plus dungeons. However, modern Mythic Plus dungeons make it a lot easier to skip mob packs you don't want to do, or just make it so skipping isn't really possible anymore. So I guess they solved it in one way or another. But the addition of these seasonal affixes were an absolute W for the expansion, and were tied to an incredibly important mode for the expansion as one of the 3 pillars of endgame content. And we still have these seasonal affixes to this day. And then of course we have the allied races, where Blizzard just kind of doubled the available races that players could use during this expansion. They had to create a whole new tab just to hold all the new races they gave you, where they didn't give you another new race until Dragonflight, where you just got a single new race. Now a lot of the races were basically just slightly different colored versions of previous races we had before, but it doesn't really matter when it comes to getting brand new racials to pick from. My current main is one of these allied races that was added in BFA, and it's because a lot of the new racials were just so much more interesting than the older ones. I love that Zandalari trolls get to pick which minor bonus you have, and you get to change it out once a week to be something else. So really, BFA seems kind of stacked with really good things. It had a masterpiece of a raid, it introduced a long-lasting mechanic to the Mythic Plus system that players actually liked, it had a whole bunch of new races to play with, which had the unintended side effects of filling the old world with people leveling these new races. It had excellent max level zone ideas, it did have an excellent endgame system with the essences, so why exactly does Azerite armor, boring islands, and warfronts overshadow all this other stuff? Well, because the gear problems don't end with Azerite. I didn't even talk about Titan Forging or Corruptions yet. Titan Forging was a mechanic not added in BFA, but it was definitely ended in BFA, where whenever you got a new piece of equipment, there was a chance that it would just be a higher item level than normal. And there was a chance it would be an incredibly higher item level than normal if it Titan Forged. The very possibility that an item could Titan Forge meant that there was always the incentive to do max level content, because you never could have a full set of Titan Forge gear. So you never could have the best possible gear in the game at the time. It literally just added a random layer of gambling to your gearing system, where if your gear didn't have some kind of Warforge or Titan Forge proc on it, it was kind of a disappointment to just get a normal piece of gear. And while it was fun to get a Titan Forge piece of gear, it caused all kinds of contempt in the community because people did not like the fact that their gear progression was tied behind a random mechanic they had no control over. So eventually Blizzard did remove it, but it was in the expansion for at least half of its lifetime. And then it was replaced with Corruptions. Now, Corruptions were a mechanic that would have a piece of gear with a huge benefit attached to them, where they could do things like increase your haste, lower the cooldowns in your abilities, or just have a proc that simply did extra damage to whatever you're attacking. And pieces of equipment could have random corruption on it whenever you got it, and corruptions had 3 different levels to them based on the kind of corruptions there were. So if you got a new pair of gloves, for example, there was a chance it could have a corruption on that piece of equipment. And there was a chance the corruption could be one of the corruptions you wanted, and then there was another chance the corruption could have a tier 3 corruption, which was the strongest of all of them and the most useful most of the time. So, they removed Titan Forging, a mechanic that people hated because it added an unnecessary level of RNG to your gear, in order to introduce an even bigger source of RNG on top of your gear. However, they did have ways to get specific corruptions, where you could just go to a vendor and just buy the corruption you wanted and just enchant them to your non-corrupted piece of gear like you would an enchant. And this totally would have solved all of the major problems with the corruption system, if it wasn't for the fact that the corruptions were on a rotating vendor, where you would have to wait a couple of weeks to be able to buy the corruption you actually needed. And the system was not introduced at the launch of the patch that introduced corruptions, so by the time you could buy the ones you wanted, you were probably done with progression if you were a hardcore player. And the corruptions also worked in PvP, so it created a balancing nightmare. However, even with all of these negative things about corruptions, the corruptions themselves were really strong. Like, insanely strong. Like, a full set of your best corruptions made you stronger than you were in Legion strong. You could lower your cooldowns on major abilities to be able to spam them. You could also have so much haste that you were melting people in less than 10 seconds in PvP. You could have so many layers of Twilight Devastation with stamina gear on that you could literally one-shot your enemy team as a tank in arena matches. The corruptions were absolutely bonkers, and that's what I loved about them. They were not balanced at all. Hardcore players hated corruptions because of how bad they made the game for them. But for us average players, being able to one-shot groups of enemies with a perfectly timed proc of Twilight Devastation was awesome. Being able to go out and collect a whole bunch of different kinds of equipments with different corruptions in order to just try out different builds was tons of fun. And also the amount of grinding that was required to get a hold of all these new pieces of gear with different corruptions definitely tickled all the parts of my brain that loves to play MMOs and grind for power increases. I loved corruptions. I loved how unbalanced they were. I loved how much grinding was required to get the ones you wanted. I loved how they worked in all types of content you did. I loved how they made getting Keystone Master a breeze during the final tier of the expansion. And I also loved that they were only in the game for that one tier and did not carry over into any other expansions. If anything, I think corruptions succeeded specifically because they were temporary. They were an excellent power imbalance created specifically because they wanted to cause a power imbalance, and because it would be the final raid of the expansion that nobody liked. So it was the perfect time to try something stupid like corruptions, and it was a masterpiece in being broken. I applaud Blizzard for trying corruptions. They were so bad. None of the streamers or YouTubers praised them for being good, and if anyone did, they'd be rightly mocked for it because they weren't good. And that's what was so great about them. Sometimes it's fun to just have an imbalanced mess, and it's another aspect of this expansion that kinda gets overlooked because of just how bad they were on paper. Objectively speaking, corruptions were not good for the game. They were absolutely terrible. But they were so much fun nonetheless. And if anything, I wanted to see Blizzard try something like this again in different expansions. Although most of the time, they never go as far as they do with corruptions and power level, and are too conservative with what kinds of crazy powers they let you get from a borrowed power mechanic. So, BFA in review. It had one of the worst gearing issues of any expansion, but also had great leveling incentives, one of the best raids, fun mechanics, although unbalanced. Part of their fun was their unbalanced nature, and tons of content to do in comparison to many other expansions. After all, we weren't missing an entire raid tier like in Worlds Draenor or Shadowlands, and even had a mini raid after Battle for dazar'alor. Was BFA as bad as people remember? In some ways, yes, because it was so bad Blizzard was free to try stupid things, and it led to tons of fun, making it a blast for people who got to enjoy it.